Yes. It's a prop, right? A good prop. So I always take notes.
All right, so we may have some other people buzzing in, a little bit later, but let's we can get started here. So we're doing Being and Some Philosophers, Gilson, Chapter 2, which is Being and Substance, which means we're really getting into Aristotle. And you might think that since he's vaguely an Aristotelian himself, that he will finally be in the place where it's all genial and he agrees with everybody, and he starts off agreeing with everybody and then quickly doesn't agree with the Averroistic Aristotelians. And so there's a kind of head fake about the whole chapter where he'll start by saying, here, at last we can breathe because we've gotten to Aristotle, who's the brass tacks, common sense philosopher, like physicians instead of mathematicians, and like Locke instead of Leibniz. And we're all on congenial ground. And by the end of the chapter, he'll be talking about how Averroistic Aristotelianism is scientifically sterile, and there's no discovery in the history of science against which it did not raise an indignant protest. So you're like head faked from the beginning and end of this chapter, right? Is this the same Aristotle we're talking about? Um, not entirely, at least. Okay, but the main thesis of the chapter is the Aristotelian thesis that being is substance. Cast of characters going to be along the way. Aristotle himself, Averroes, Sigurd of Brabant, and with passing mentions of Spinoza as continuing in this tradition in some respects, and foils, if I can put it that way, to contrast this with from Avicenna for Averroes, and to some degree Aquinas for Sigurd of Brabant. So, but you're not going to get sort of the full Avicennian position on all this. Let's get some of that in the next chapter, and you only get parts of what Gilson thinks of as the Aquinas position on the subject, which is going to unfold in this chapter and the next chapter and the chapter after that, and sort of be dribbled out in pieces by its contrast with the other folks. Is that Gabriel joining us? He's still getting off mute or something. Okay, so that's basic outline of where we're going, and there's lots of different topics to be raised on the Aristotle stuff. I want to first make sure that some of the caster characters are well enough known, because so for plenty of people history is challenging, and the way Gilson himself positions Aristotle coming in, positioning on the problem of universals and so forth, but then the relation of all these different things. The problem of being and the problem of universals, the problem of both, and the problem of psychology, or how is understanding possible, the other problematics that Aristotle brings up. And separately from the stuff we've done before, we're going to keep our eyes on the ways in which all this differs from, relates to the Platonic and Neoplatonic traditions, and maybe also ways in which there are things in some of the Nietzsche and Heidegger we did earlier that are touched on here. Okay, that's just sort of, welcome Alex too. That's just sort of immediate background. I want to give people a chance to have first reactions before we dive into my take on any of these things. But we can start with Jim on just initial reactions to chapter 2. Jim is on mute.
Well, their initial, that's a tough. It was great. I really enjoyed it. I couldn't figure out if he was. I think this is just about use of terminology, a discussion about substance dualism. It seemed to be he was trying to make characteristics like properties, because my conception of this, or understanding at this point, is properties are had by substances, which he kind of gets into that. But the terminology he used.
Slow you down right here. Okay, so substance, the thesis of the chapter is being as substance. We have to understand what substance means and separate the issue of what substance means in Aristotle's doctrine of substance and Aristotle's understanding of being as substance on the one hand, from anything like a later problematic about whether or not there are two substances, or substance dualism, right? So the later early modern problematic you find in mind versus matter in Descartes or something like that, yes, it has echoes in some of these things, but keep separate the issue of different theses about how many substances there are from just what we mean by substance, right? The thesis of this chapter is Aristotle's thesis that when we say being, we mean the substance. And what does he mean by the substance? The substance is, to a first approximation for Aristotle, it is the composite of matter and form, at least for the material particulars. It is the thing of which we predicate, but as a unity of a matter and a form that come together to make the full substance, right? So it's not simply a term of logic in the sense that it's not just saying something about the subject matter of a sentence and that of which we predicate, right? He will line up a bunch of things about the sort of logical machinery or the conceptual machinery with the sort of ontological thesis. But the ontological stuff he's trying to talk about is the idea that individual beings are, and they are because they are substances, and they are substances because they are compositions of a matter and a form, right? In which the form, which the matter is, formed by the form, takes the shape or outline or substantial characteristics of the form, right? But that it needs the matter to be individuated as an individual instance, or to have the activity of being an act, or something like that. All of which are part of saying that it is the particular substance which is. And the particular substance is not just a form, and it's not just a matter. It's a composition of a matter and a form, a synalon in the Greek. Okay, so and then all that gets, why is it all being called a substance? It's being called substance in the sense of a meaning of being. It's also being called substance as that which stands underneath, or the subject of prepositions in the Aristotelian sort of logical understanding of these things. Okay, but it's not fundamentally a logical theory. It's not starting off as a theory of how we speak about things. It's starting off with a theory about how things actually are. And then secondarily, we will speak about them in more or less precise ways for our purposes, and which of those things correspond to the things that are, which one are abstractions will be, stuff that the whole philosophy has to sort out. But being as substance is trying to say that something is, if it is a material particular composed of matter and form, and all the things that aren't material but are particular we'll have to talk about too, and all the things which aren't particular, like universals, we'll have to talk about too, in what sense those things are or are not, or are or not substances. But the characteristic Aristotelian thesis of the chapter compared to the chapter before is that instead of thinking of being as in terms of a kind of logical definition or identity that we got in Plato, we're now thinking of it as a substance that is a composition of a matter and a form. Okay, so sorry, James, continue. I just wanted to make sure that we're clear on what we mean by the substance. It's the thesis of the chapter.
Oh yeah, because I didn't know. I was actually trying to think. I'm like, I wonder if he's going to get to this, because I was saying my introduction to the topic was later in history than what he was alluding to. But I thought that was interesting. As I thought, well, the fact that he talked about whiteness, that was like, well, that'll be an interesting social topic. And the way that he, that I thought those things were all fun. I'm like, well, okay, I guess you could debate now whether or not a man is actually a man. I thought that might be interesting as a side discussion. But all in all, I thought it was very intriguing. I'm interested in seeing where it goes from here. And I try to limit myself to the chapter so that I don't jump ahead. I want to understand it in this context of the chapter, even though I want to know where he's going to wind up. But overall, it was really interesting, enlightening.
Yeah. The next question is for people like the Averroes or the Sigurd Brabant. Were these people new to you, or do you have not much understanding of where they are? Were you familiar with some but not others? How new
no,
was
I wasn't familiar with Sigurd at all, and I was interested in getting into that because those individuals, no frame of reference for. So it was interesting to see him arguing about them and what they were wrong, where they were right. So yeah, I'm very interested in seeing where that goes.
Okay. We'll definitely
I have too many questions, so
we'll definitely do some history of that period. And but okay, Alex, want to give us your first reactions to chapter 2?
Sure, yeah, I can try. I enjoyed the chapter. I needed to catch up with the first one, and that contrast between identity and now this question of existence, which goes beyond what things are. So I thought he did a good job of making that clear. That distinction came out clearly a few times, and I appreciated that. I guess there are parts of the chapter that I found a little bit difficult to follow, whether because the text seemed a little bit muddled, or maybe my understanding is not all that great. But towards the end, when he brought in Seigent, I think Seigent of Brabant, something like that.
Sigurd, yeah.
That was a little bit difficult for me to follow. But yeah, I also like the way he explained the Aristotelian worldview and the Aristotelian universe. That was very clear, and that was very helpful, I thought. And so for me, one takeaway is I wasn't very clear on exactly what it means. There is Aristotle, and then there is Aristotle within Christianity, and I wasn't very clear on that difference. And now it's clear to me that existence plays a key part, because for the Greeks, it seems existence is not really, and maybe individuality going along with it, they were not important topics. And, in Christianity, it seems that becomes really important. So that for me was really interesting.
Yeah, so you're right that by the time you're in the later scholastics, the problem of the individuals is a much more serious one, and understanding let's put it this way, the metaphysical structure of a single individual, right? Something like that, and precisely because it's a place where the Platonic traditions on the one side and the Aristotelian tradition on the other are kind of crossing each other, and it's difficult to keep all of it straight. There's also a bunch of stuff about the history of how Aristotle was incorporated into later traditions, and those into the Christian West in particular, before the time of Aquinas or so, or even Averroes. And I want to talk a little about some of that history, because it's quite complicated. There are versions of the late Hellenic world's Aristotle that had already been processed by various Neoplatonists to try to assimilate it to a Neoplatonic tradition, right? And the result was a lot of positions that even in the Islamic Middle Ages were thought of as Aristotelian positions were already amalgams of bits of Aristotle with lots of Neoplatonism. And this is especially pronounced in some like Avicenna, right? Whereas Averroes, after seeing Avicenna criticized for a lot of his Neoplatonic elements, will try to go back to a purer Aristotle, so to speak. So we have to talk a little bit about the complicated history of Aristotle between Aristotle and Averroes, if I can put it that way. But there's definitely a great history story, so to speak, independent of just the philosophical story, about how all that played out. And in a way, this all comes to a head in the period towards the end of Aquinas's life, when there's a big controversy at the University of Paris about all this, and all the characters are on the field either then or immediately thereafter, reacting to it. And so, simultaneously, Sigurd and Aquinas are both debating Aristotelian theses in Paris, and then various others are coming in and banning them both, and all kinds of drama goes on around all that. But the philosophical theses are in some ways more interesting than the history, but it helps to know a little bit of the history, just know who all those characters are, and to be able to distinguish the subtle ways in which they're disagreeing with each other, so to speak. Okay, definitely want to get into some of that. You also mentioned the him being particularly clear on the problem of existence. I'm not sure how clear he is on the problem of existence in this chapter. He'll be talking more about it in the next chapter, but existence is certainly the topic that Gilson regards as kind of Aquinas's special contribution, as a clear understanding of existence. and it's not clear how much of a notion of existence as opposed to substance you need in Aristotle. And he's making a lot of claims in this chapter that like Averroes or Siger are proof that a pure Aristotelianism doesn't have room for a notion of existence as opposed to a notion of substance, which he thinks Aquinas does make room for. So there's a way in which he's trying to leave existence as a special new thing that Aquinas can clarify that he thinks that the previous Aristotelians hadn't clarified. Okay, but I think it's fair to say that we're getting all of our Aquinas here in glancing blows, right? We're getting, you know, Aquinas differentiated from Averroes, and we're getting the next chapter we'll get Aquinas differentiated from Avicenna, and you know we'll keep going on that way. We'll get, you know, Aquinas versus, you know, a large cast of characters before you get like just Aquinas himself. And partly that's Gilson's plan. He wants the various differentia of Aquinas from the other positions not to be just expository in one chapter, but to come out in the history of all the other ones, so to speak. So
does he get into nominalism and univocity and Duns Scotus and?
Yeah, he certainly gets into Scotus, especially later on, Avicenna and Scotus, and then Suarez. He spends less time on the pure nominalist positions of people like William of Ockham, who, from his point of view, are all, not all, is kind of a attacking every person in this tradition from outside of it, rather than taking a position inside that tradition. His general history of scholastic philosophy does include plenty on William of Ockham, but and there's ways which you can see some of the positions of William of Ockham in the West as being parallel to some of the positions of Ghazali in the East, in terms of similar criticisms of the philosophers. But Ockham isn't going to be the main focus here. Ockham is traditionally thought of as the medieval exponent of nominalism, but in part for theological reasons rather than for purely philosophical reasons. But there's ways in which Ockham's nominalism also lines up in a way he certainly would not expect with some of the things we saw in months past in Nietzsche, in the sense that both of them believe that the generals that we see in the particulars we put there. They are projections of our mind for our purposes, and that equivalence is one of them is stating it from an extremely anti-theological position, and the other from an extremely theological position, but they're both stating the same thing, that such universals as we see in the particulars are put there by the mind, not read off of the existence. So anyway, fair question about Occam. We won't get so much to Occam later on. If you are interested in him, I can recommend this little book. So it's a good intro to what he's about. Okay.
Could you, Jason? Could you just say the name of that? I wasn't able.
Sorry, it's just called Philosophical Writings, Occam, translated by
okay.
Philotheusius Bonaire. Who's a Franciscan professor of philosophy. But it's a selection of his writings, but it's a pretty good one. Okay.
Thanks.
Gabriel, did you do the reading? Welcome.
Thank you. Yes, I did do the reading, and I also did last week's reading as well, which was fantastic. So I really enjoyed both of them. General impressions. I would have liked him to sort of spend more time talking about the virtues of the Aristotelian system. Like, I feel like he went quite fast to sort of saying how it falls short, but I did like how he brought out some sort of paradoxes and tensions within it. Like, for instance, you know, the individual versus the species, like where is the real being, so to speak? Like, is it in the species or is it in the individual? And also just like the kind of moving yet static nature of the Aristotelian universe. Like, everything's in movement, but there's no actual change. I found that pretty cool. And I also liked his rhetoric sometimes. Like, he talked about the actual system itself through history never changes, just as within the system, the universe never changes. So Averroes is basically saying that Aristotle got the whole thing correct, and all he's doing is just repeating it or, you know, clarifying it. So Yeah, I thought it was a great reading.
Yeah. So I think it's fair to say that his version of how static the Aristotelian world is coming in largely from the Averroes end of the spectrum, right? He's thinking of Spinoza, of Averroes, and of Sigurd Brabant between them, more than of Aristotle himself, who is subtler on this point. And there are some, very good classic scholars who have traced this whole history, who will tell you that Aristotle is wrestling with issues that he doesn't think he's fully resolved, and has all kinds of subtlety and distinction and different glances at things. And there's a lot more aphoretic treatments in Aristotle, where he doesn't think he knows the answer. He'll give you both sides of the story and leave you with the problem. And that the tendency from the later Hellenic age commentators, and even more so later, has been to try to make Aristotle clear and systematic, even to the point of they clean up the Aristotelian text, which is difficult to understand, by imposing on it more univocity than it has, right? More simplicity than it has. And they, will have their favorite text that they use to come down on this side or the other of a place where Aristotle actually goes both sides of the argument. But the result can be a semi-Aristotelian position that is indebted to Aristotle, but is really the position of those later commentators or systematizers themselves. And I think that's very clear in someone like Averroes. I think that there's much less subtlety in Averroes' Aristotle than there is in original Aristotle. If you want a good book on that one, I can highly recommend this. It's an amazingly dense book. But this is Edward Booth, early 1980s. And he knows the degree of complexity in the Aristotelian ontology extremely well, and then he traces that all the way through to the different reactions to it, down to Aquinas, and the ways in which they ran with this or that side of some dichotomy in Aristotle. And he has a good finger on where, Aristotle left this undetermined because it's a serious problem how to figure it out, and he didn't actually have an answer to it. So these later guys took this answer, and these other guys objected to it for this reason and took this other answer, and those changes get spun through the history. But on the degree to which there is change in the Aristotelian world as opposed to the later Aristotelians, compared to Plato or Parmenides or a lot of the Neoplatonics, Aristotle is definitely the philosopher of the material particulars, acting in time kind of end of the spectrum. He's trying to be much more, we would say, concrete that way, and which is a departure from how concerned with abstract eternal being Plato or Parmenides were. Now, the thing which is the kind of holdover here, and the reason that this is so aphoretic in Aristotle, is he also is the codifier of logic, who thinks that knowledge is of the universal, and you have to be able to reason logically about things to reach actual scientific knowledge of them. And scientific knowledge, as knowledge of generals to generals, has the necessity of logic. So things which are universal and general to general and follow logically, and therefore with complete necessity, go along with a very platonically static, fixed nature of things, which is very different from Aristotle's own starting point with the material particulars. So that leaves them with the whole question of how is scientific knowledge of material nature possible, right? That's kind of the critical thing in Aristotle. And first of all, is it possible? And second of all, what do you wind up knowing about it? Do you only wind up knowing universals about it? Or can you know particulars about it? And how? Now, Plato's ideas were an attempt to explain how you can have something like a correspondence between what the mind thinks and the abstract patterns in the things they think about by a formal equivalence across them. And the objection to, you don't know where those ideas are, you can't tell me what those ideas are, so I don't believe in them, right? Deals with the plausibility of the solution, but it leaves the problem that it was a solution to, right? Which is explaining how true understanding of an eternal truth happens in time inside a finite mind or something like that. So the place where this winds up being the biggest issue for Aristotle is not really in his physics or metaphysics, it's in his de anima, his theory of the soul and theory of understanding in the soul in particular. So Aristotle needs a theory of mind to explain how what Plato was explaining with ideas works in the Aristotelian world. And if you go read those parts of De Anima, what you find is he's got, a pretty good theory about how all this happens. But when it comes to the place where he's got to have the absolute last brass tacks, make a decision, show how the anti-Platonism is consistent, he instead falls back on a little piece of Platonism. And it's that has created all kinds of debates after that, because people were, have put all kinds of interesting different doctrines in that position to replace what Aristotle put there, because what Aristotle had there was kind of a little bit of a dodge back to something which, implies Platonism, something like that. But the point is that you have to look at the problem ideas was trying to solve, and Aristotle jumps out of that frying pan into a different fire, which is to explain how mind works. But someone like Aquinas thinks he's got that sorted, right? A lot of the later scholastics thinks that they have figured out a way to get a kind of consistent Aristotelian understanding of mind, which isn't going to be entirely Aristotelian, right? Yeah, okay, so, and then, other people after will disagree with bits of that. But okay, just reacting to the how unchanging is the Aristotelian world, right? Some of that it's the later Aristotelians that have made it more unchanging than it was for Aristotle. Okay, Craig, first impressions of chapter 2 especially.
First impression is digging the cobwebs out. I read Coplestone in the about 1970 timeframe, so it's been almost 50 years, and so it really is digging some cobwebs out to go back over some of this kind of stuff. I did feel like, in many respects, he is the current writer we're studying is a better teacher. He is very instructive. I picked up the little thing about the actual subject receives the title of substance because it can be figuratively fancied as standing under accidents, that is, as supporting them. That just summed it right up for me. It was yes. Excellently done, and I thought, I missed that for so many years in terms of what was there. Mm-hmm. The other thing I'm looking forward to continuing more on it. Back in the 70s, the other thing I was studying was Paul Tillich, who spent a lot of time wrestling around with this and trying to cross the boundary between philosophy and religion, or theology and religion, or theology and philosophy. So I found it fascinating. Especially liked his other little play that he had. It's page 49 in mine, which is the original one, about what Socrates might have said if he had read Aristotle. That was a great little
yes.
Again,
Plato's dialogue, the Aristoteles, right?
Yeah, that was fun.
That was fun. Cool. That was the kind of instructor I wish I had more of when I was taking this in the dark ages of college. So yes. That was fascinating about it. Generally, I can see he's building chapter by chapter, so I'm looking forward to continuing with it. That's why I finally was able to get back into this discussion, because the book caught me. Initially, I thought, we'll see what it's like, but he really is turning out to be an excellent teacher, and especially filling in the history.
Great. Glad to have you. For those who don't know, Craig was a longtime regular in the philosophy group back when we could actually meet in person. Hello, and he's getting waved at.
I was just waving to Craig.
Yeah, we're familiar with him from the Young group as well. So
yes. Okay, Joe, reactions to chapter 2.
Oh well, I was struggling a little bit. I've never had this stuff before. Many of you obviously saw this much more recently in graduate school or even in college and with courses, whereas I never really had any courses. I had exposure through conversations and stuff and other awarenesses, but it sort of hit me between the eyes and made me really confused when he pointed out that Aristotle doesn't believe in existence. And, you know, as I read on, that became more of a statement that was comprehensible in the context in which he said it. And I certainly agree with Craig. The substance, when you think substance, it's just so obvious, you know, but I never thought of it either. And it's very good. I kept thinking about you know, he talks about form, material, and something else, but I thought action, you know, the fact that it has to be an action to become actual is something very critical to existence. And so I'm still trying to learn this. That's why I'm glad we're recording this. And I plan to, as I did with the chapter 1 after the recording, was to reread parts of it on Plotinus that I didn't get earlier. I'm planning to look at the second half of this in Easer more closely.
If I may, on actuality and existence, right? This is definitely going to be, I mean, one way to think about it is existence is a particular thesis or claim about how something like actuality works, or the metaphysical structure of actuality, if I can put it that way. There are going to be other philosophers who will still talk about actuality and distinguish it from essence or potentiality, but they won't use a notion of existence to do it, right? Aristotle is certainly a philosopher of potency and act, of things being an act and having an action, and we'll come to some of the categories involved in that in a second. But Gilson's point is that he doesn't need a notion of existence to do that. He needs a notion of actuality, and he needs a notion of substance. But for him, it is the substances that are actual that act. So let's get into first the distinction between a substance or an essence and a nature, right? The first point here is what is a nature? To Aristotle, a nature is something like all the powers of a substance. It's all the things it can do, right? The web of relationships it can enter into. And the claim here is similar to like the later pragmatic claims we got in Heidegger a while ago, that we first know the thing from its web of causal relationships, including causal relationships with our senses, the way that it can affect us, as well as the things we can do with it, its powers, the relationships it enters into, its position in an equipmental contexture, whatever. These are later ways of saying the same thing, which is that we know the.
This is how this is how planets, Neptune and Pluto, were discovered this way. They saw disturbances and.
Sure, but there you have to assume that your previous theory of gravitation is correct, et cetera, right? But the naive sense is that, and this is related to what when Heidegger talked about being as the meaning of the thing to our acting organism, right? It's the same kind of idea that the things that the thing does, the acts that it performs, the potencies of which it is capable, are what we understand as its nature, right? So the substance is one thing, right? But its nature is the totality of its possible acts. That's what we mean by its nature. So there's an epistemological component to the idea of nature, right? It's something we can know about it because it's causal relationships that it enters into. There's a pragmatic aspect to the notion of nature, right? It's activity. So something that didn't have any actions, we wouldn't be able to detect. We would not be able to know its nature, something like that. Okay, so and from this you get the notion that the nature is something like the phenomenal, experientiable, knowable attributes or characteristics or powers of the thing, but there's something which is doing all those things, right? There's some essence which is capable of performing those natural causal relationships. And we say capable of, we're saying that there's potential in it, right? So when it actualizes any of those potentials, there's something which is doing the actual act of realizing those potentials. So in Aristotelian terms, the power is a dynamis, right? And the act is an activity, an energeia, right? So the activity of the thing is not just something we know about its nature or something that's revealing its nature to us. It is the actuality of the realization of some potential that its essence had, right? All of its potential powers, so to speak, are its nature. The essence is the thing which has all those potential powers. The actuality of the thing is those things becoming, we tend to say real, but the right term is becoming actual in time, right? Truly occurring now, here, right? So that sense of the actuality of something as the act that it performs. He talks on page 44 about how the scholastics distinguish between the first act and the second act. The first act of something is just that it is, and that it is the way that it is. The act that the thing performs by being what it is, right? And only secondarily does it enter into other acts, which are other relations to other things, right? But first it's performing the act of being what it is. And they call that the actus primus, right, of the thing. So just distinguishing a bunch of things here, right? There's the nature, which is just our sort of pragmatic view of the thing from the causal relationships it can enter into, its powers, right? The full substance is supposed to be what has those powers, right? And the actuality is the full substance actually enacting one or more of its powers, right? That's what's that's what actually happens. So, and for Aristotle, it is first and foremost a determinate material particular acting in that sense that is kind of ontologically primary, right? All the other things we encounter as attributes, accidents, qualia, whatever, he's going to trace back to some substance actually performing some act, right? And the claim is that the way the world actually works, so to speak, is that there are substances that act, and those enter into causal relationships with our senses or us, right, that we can discover. But the underlying, really their primal being thing is substances, actual substances acting. And then just as Plato tried to factor the notion of one of those beings into something like a definition and its oneness and a bunch of these other logical constituents of it, Aristotle is going to try to factor that substance into the components of the substance, which to him are the form and the matter, right? The form is the in a way the actualization of the substance as the real thing. It's what makes it do one thing rather than another thing, but it has to also have a matter that is formed by that form in order to be. The substance isn't just the form. It has to be instantiated, right? And instantiated in time in a way that is active. And this notion that the instantiation in time of the acting thing is the same as the putting the merely possible abstract form or power together with a material substrate or being. That's what he means by substance, right? It's the synalon, the composition of that matter and that form. Now, obviously, this immediately gives rise to all kinds of problems, and you're trying to think about things which don't obviously have matter in that sense, right? What about truths of mathematics, right? What about abstract facts about genera, or truths that are true of all men as a species, right? These are all things which aren't clearly material particulars in that sense. So do they have being? What is their actuality, if they have any, right? How do we know them? All kinds of all sorts of things like that become problems for this ontology. But he's starting off with the notion that the material particulars we can hit with a stick are real. They're made out of matter and form, and they act in time. And that's what we mean by them being loosely termed real, strictly said actual. And I think that Gilson is just right, that is the fundamental thing about Aristotle, is the fact that he's trying to go back to the particulars. He's trying to get away from thinking of things as just towers of logical abstractions. And whatever he's going to think about what counts as being, or what substance is, he wants it to be true of the material particulars first of all, right? And that's his kind of litmus test of, you know, are we talking about something real? Or are we talking about an abstraction? The other thing to realize is that Aristotle is the guy who is, well, not the guy, he's a guy who is very careful about the distinctions between the language of how we talk about the things and the way the things we're trying to talk about, right? Because he's a codifier of logic, because he's, you know, very carefully distinguishing the different kinds of argument or reasoning. He's not just going to assume that if we have a term for something that it's one of the fundamental constituent bones of the world, right? He's going to distinguish between the language about how we reason about things and the things we're trying to refer to or talk about. So he's got this very universal, abstract conceptual logic and this very concrete material particulars are real ontology, right? And then a giant problem of putting the two of them together, right? You need a whole theory about how we understand what is general in this particular being. We have a man in front of us. This man, Socrates, right? But we notice the universality manness in him and the higher universality animal in him, right? As a generic thing about him. And we need to know, what is it about this particular Socrates here that we understand in terms of those things? And is it just something we're understanding about it, or is it really there in them, right? And in what sense is it really there in them? And he mostly is going to come down on the side of it is really there in them and it's related to their form rather than their whole substance, so that the individual men share some form in common such that they are all men, but have different matters that differentiate them into this man versus that man. Whether or not that's a sufficient way of thinking about this, the later medievals will, you know, go over with a fine-tooth comb, so to speak. But to start with, the initial position is something like, the reason there seem to be universals in things is that the particulars share forms, not in the sense of in our minds and not in some Platonic realm of the ideas, but in the sense of sameness of shape, right? So that sameness is something which we can see or appreciate in them because it's actually there. There is some manness that makes all men alike in their manness, right? But not because there's a manness off in the realm of mathematical abstraction that is injected into each of the individual men. The individual men are the ontologically prior locus of being things, and manness is something formal about them that they have in common. Go, Joe.
Thank you. I don't want to divert you, but I do want to bring up a topic that you seem to have touched on that puzzled me as I was going through this chapter in Gilson. It occurred to me that Heidegger addressed this when it came at one point. I just accidentally came across this again. He talks about, you know, if there's a table in the room and the Dasein that is relating to it ceases to be there, does the table cease to be there? And he says, no, it's still there. And he talks about it on and on. He talks about the ontic and the ontological and makes distinctions. And I'm just wondering how this relates to, I'm going to stop right here and let you see if it works in any place. As a
right. So
answer.
There's an underlying question there of to what degree is the unity of the constituents of the table that we project in our minds to get the equipmental table that we can interact with causally, to what extent is that something we just put there as a useful for us abstraction, and to what degree is it already there in the table constituents themselves, right? Heidegger is enough of a realist, he's going to come down on the side of the table is actually already there, right? And it already enters into causal relationship with us, such that our treating it as a unified table is useful to us, useful to our purposes, useful to our understanding of our own possibilities of action. But it has to already have that degree of not only substance, but operational causal unity in the ways that it can be interacted with, right? That has to really be there. That cannot be just projected there, right? For us to treat it that way. Now, someone like a Nietzsche, on the other hand, is thinking that, yes, it has a value to acting man this or that way, but all the structure there was put onto something which is at bottom just a disorganized chaos, right? He's going to think that the human purposes have much more to do with the unity of the table than a Heidegger does. Both of those, though, are dealing with a concern with a much more subjective understanding of what the tableness is than the people in this tradition. The people in this tradition are thinking of the shape of the table as a real constituent outside the world that is not dependent upon our minds, whether they're Aristotelians or the Platonists. The Platonists might also think that the idea of the table exists in the mathematical realm, and the individual table is only an approximation to it. But the reasons about the abstract table, right, are actually the thing which is enabling our minds to know truths about it that let us interact with it. And the imperfections of the realization of the actual table, that it wobbles a little bit, are, that's the typical not entirely intelligibleness of them, right? So where Aristotle would be impressed by the activity and timeness of the table, making it real, Plato would be impressed with the departures of the table from our idea of the table as the ways in which it is somewhat less than real.
I had
Jim.
a question.
Yes.
Would you say then, is it safe to say things like tables have no teleological aspect, and the distinction between physical objects and, I guess, beings like us are that there's no teleology associated with a physical object like a rock or a table?
Well, there obviously is a teleological. There obviously is a teleological aspect of the table, right? I mean, it's put together in a certain way to perform actual human purposes, precisely as an artifact, right? And some of the people in these traditions will think there's aspects of that in more things than just human artifacts. But obviously, we think about the table teleologically because we made the table with ends in mind, and we keep it within constraints where it can do its tableness job, or we don't treat it very much as a table. The other side of that is that tableness job might be performed by a tree stump at times, right? We don't have to have made the thing exactly for it if it can crudely fulfill the functions. But they're not. None of this is trying to avoid the notion that there are teleological aspects of any of this. There could easily be teleological aspects of any of this. Okay, but I think I've tried to lay out a little bit of what Aristotle means by the being as substance and how it differs from the go Alex. You're on mute. Go.
Yeah, I've got a question about
Sure.
So this structure of a potential becoming actual, it seems to me this is, in a way, it's the heart of Aristotelian, or it's one of the centers of Aristotelian thinking. And it seemed like from Gilson's chapter here that there are questions about how exactly does this happen. And it seems like one extreme was with Avicenna, and then Averroes, I think it becomes even more extreme, where in a sense, nothing really happens there. In a sense, you don't have a change. You just have maybe a kind of emanation. But
right. Yeah, so let's get into why that is, right? So it'll take the case of Averroes, right? So Averroes wants it to be the case that whatever natural power something has, right, it performs those acts in a way that is related to all other, abstract or conceptual or formal characteristics in exactly the same way as logic, right? The point is that there is an attempt in the Aristotelian understanding to think of what we would think of as physical causation and logical entailment as being the same thing, right? If X follows from Y logically, that's why Y succeeds X in the train of becoming. They're mapping determinism in physical unfolding in time and determinism of deduction in logic one to one and on to each other, right? So the logical entailments of concepts and the structure that the instances of those objects have to have with one another are the same. And in that sense, just as whatever follows from an axiomatic system follows from it with apodictic necessity, right? Whatever follows from a logically understood set of Aristotelian nature propositions about the natures of things, also follows with ineluctable necessity. They're deductions. This power implies this realization, right? There's no room, so to speak, for a possible slippage there. So even though we're talking about possibles and actualization, to Averroes, the actualization has the form of something like a logical deduction. So from Averroes' point of view, when we're saying a possible being, we're also saying a being that is finite in time. And it's possible until it is, and then it's necessary until it isn't, and then it's back to being possible or perhaps just not, right? What we mean by possible is only subsists or exists for a finite period of time. The finiteness in time of something, that's what we mean by a possible. Things which are possible, which are actual all the time, aren't accurately described as possible. They're necessary, and they always are. And we only use the term possible to describe things which can sometimes be and at other times not be. And what we mean by possible is precisely that there is a limited period of time in which they are. Now, they're always doing that in a background of everything else, which always is. And they're in a web of necessary relations to all that rest of it. So in Avicennian language that's adopted by Averroes, something is either necessary in itself or it's necessary from something else, its cause. And to Averroes, or even more so to someone like Spinoza, everything is necessary by its cause. There's no such thing as a pure possible that isn't necessary by its cause. So this is the way in which you get something where, yes, there's a whole theory of possibility here, but it's so closely tied to a notion of logical necessity as the way in which these natures act with one another that you get this tissue of, we would call it determinism. And it's really a conceptual determinism rather than a physical determinism. It's not making a claim about how the physical world has to act. It's saying the logical entailments of this formal structure, right, require this consequent. And that's because they're trying to get Aristotelian logic acting on formal things to explain the world, right? Which is in a way also what mathematical physics does, right? Okay, so you're definitely right to highlight that it's curious that we've got this notion of possibility here, and this notion of the actualization of possibility is what's characteristic of Aristotle, and he's talking about all this happening in time. But at the same time, with people like Averroes and Spinoza, we've got a version of this that seems to have no room for anything uncertain to happen. All the things that happen seem to be certain, so you get this kind of Parmenidean block universe of everything is entailed in the initial conditions kind of things, right? Okay, and the claim is that the claim in Gilson is that the reason that we're getting that is because although they're claiming that there are only these material particulars that are, all of their action, all of their nature is coming from their essences, is coming from their forms, and those forms have the same relationships between them that logical categories had for Plato. So that they're reasoning about a Aristotelian world as though Platonic idealism were true, so to speak. Craig.
So this is an area that I want to just put an aside on, but I'm looking forward to future looking at interpretations of quantum physics and the loss of determinism, leading to the openness of potentialities, possibilities, and everything seems to tie right in here. And I'm not sure anybody who's spent time on that in the quantum physics side has the philosophy history to really go out and delve into it the way we're dealing with the history.
Yeah, you're right, and I will say that there's different takes on that even in physics, if I can put it that way. There are people who are mathematically Platonist enough that they want a many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics because it lets them have something with a deterministic evolution, and there's others that want a real event of non-deterministic evolution, and in that whole debate, Gilson is definitely on the side of saying, these theologically inspired philosophies that have real possibility in them and real uncertainty in them make more sense to him than the supposedly more rational, but to him just more coherent, if I can put it that way, Averroistic or Spinoza-esque systems of necessity, so to speak.
Yeah, that's
now,
kind of why I like him.
Alex?
Yeah, I just had a question about that, but not sure if I cut off Craig or.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Alex.
Okay.
You're good. You're good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was curious about sort of the contrast case to this Parmenidean block, I guess a kind of logical block universe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Jason, you were just getting at that with this more theologically inspired philosophies, where
Gilson.
I suppose, right. And I guess it seems like the difference is, on the other side would be much more maybe empiricist and much more oriented towards the senses, the particulars and individuals that we get in the senses. And also another difference seems to be with the Averroist type, there is an emphasis on intellect. And on the other side, it seems you have an emphasis on will.
So you're right that some of the theologians, at least, want to get something like an indeterminism from something like a will, and you see this in people like Schopenhauer and people like Dilthey in the 19th century and so forth. But it's curious that in the older pre-modern period or the early modern period, not even pre-modern actually, I was thinking the early Christian period. These positions are somewhat reversed, right? The issue to them winds up being less determinism and more, does the world have a beginning in time or not? And they think of the Aristotelians as the guys who say that the universe is eternal, and the Platonists as being the guys that say that the universe has a beginning in time, right? Universes with beginnings in time are less obviously causally determined throughout than universes that are eternal. Because universes that are eternal can be thought to be behaving according to an eternal necessity eternally, but universes that begin in time have at least one point where they're doing something bizarrely different from the rest of their time, so to speak, right? So the later theological discussion winds up getting mapped onto this world eternal, world created notion. And in that dichotomy, Plato is the one who's thought of as being on the side of the world with a beginning in time point of view, which might map to a greater likelihood of indeterminism. It certainly did for many of the theologians who would, equate a world being able to begin in time from nothing as, allowing miracles or something like that. But okay, the point is that before they were thinking primarily as about determinism, indeterminism, they were thinking of it primarily as world eternal, world beginning in time. And there, the characteristic difference between Plato and Aristotle is that Aristotle is the world is eternal guy, and Plato is the world is beginning in time guy. Even though you might think that the Parmenidean block universe, which is called Parmenidean, right, is more on the Plato side of that distinction and more mind-like. So it's curious how those things flip, right? In the Heraclitus Parmenides, distinction, Heraclitus is the philosopher of change, in which lots of things are happening and in becoming and in time, and Parmenides is the stable being is, right? A pole of monism, something like that. But by the time you're at Aristotle and versus Plato, on this issue of eternity or beginning in time, they're in the opposite direction. Anyway, it's a fair question, but I don't think that you need to have a theological reason for indeterminism. It may be that some people did and came out that way, but there are purely philosophical reasons for an indeterminism, including some which are purely epistemological, people like Popper I'm thinking of, but also in just whether it's philosophies of will or even philosophies of nature. But maybe take us too far afield. I don't want to leave the impression that no one thought of the idea of an indeterminate future unless they were doing so for theological reasons. It's not the case. Some do for that reason. Okay. I think we've covered, these are all great questions, and I think we've covered a fair amount of the sort of basic being a substance thing. I want to talk a little about the history, because people already mentioned not knowing all these characters. I want to just get a little bit of background of very quickly, of the history of Aristotelianism between Aristotle and Averroes, and some of the other positions along the way we'll run into, and then the actual characters in this chapter, Averroes and Sigurd of Brabant, and situate them in the 13th century conjuncture, so to speak, where all this stuff is immediately coming to a head, so to speak, in the debates in Paris. But the first, a little bit of background. So after Aristotle, for a long time, it's just, Aristotle is a doctrine of the schools, and the Peripatetics are going on about it. And then there's two great commentators on him, Alexander and Themistius, who try to systematize him more. And some of them are especially Themistius, are reacting to attempts to put him together with Plato by people like Proclus after Plotinus, who were trying to create a kind of united front of Plato and Aristotle against some of the budding monotheisms, if I can put it that way. You find that in Proclus. So he's in a Neoplatonic tradition, but he's trying to assimilate a bunch of Aristotle. And people like Themistius come along and say, that's not actually what Aristotle said. He actually differs from Plato on all these points, and so forth. So there's this tradition in the sort of late Hellenic world from like 200 AD to 500 AD, these different commentators talking about Aristotle, who are resisting the attempt to simply assimilate him to Neoplatonism and digest him into Neoplatonism. And another character that's important in this is John Phillippanus, and he's a critic of those Proclean Neoplatonists and of Aristotle, although he's also a commentator on Aristotle. Basically, he's saying that the Neoplatonists aren't representing Plato fairly, and that that Plato represented fairly is more consistent with the theological traditions that Phillippanus is interested in. He's a Christian, than the Neoplatonism of the Proclean variety is, that's digested all this Aristotle, right? And the particular debate they have is against Proclus on the eternity of the world, is Phillippanus's book, right? Where he's basically trying to say, Proclus gives all these arguments why Plato doesn't really mean that the world has a beginning in time, in the Timaeus, because that would be inconsistent with Aristotle and would break up our united front of the position of the rational philosophers. And John Phillippanus is not having it. Plato disagreed violently with Aristotle on the point, and Proclus can't paper over the differences. And by the way, in his disagreement with Aristotle on the point, Plato was more likely right. So that's the position of someone like a John Phillippanus. So all of that is swirling around in the late Hellenic world, if I can put it that way, when Christianity is just getting started. The other thing to understand is that because of how much of this syncretic putting together of the different traditions there had been, a bunch of stuff circulated in the the early Middle Ages and in the Islamic East early on that were parts of this kind of Neoplatonic synthesis, but that had Aristotle's name on the masthead. So there's a book that circulated in the Islamic countries called The Theology of Aristotle, under that name, which was actually a cliff notes to Plotinus's Enneads. So it's pure Neoplatonistic philosophy, but it's presented as the theology of Aristotle. And from the standpoint of people who had imbibed that, they see Aristotle as, yes, he's the codifier of logic and he's the inventor of this other ontology. He's also the person who is the who has the first cause argument, right? He's the person with the best philosophical proof of the existence of God. And so that is the fact that that would be assimilated to a whole Neoplatonic hierarchy seems to make perfect sense to them. It would fit just in fine with, fit in fine with the knowing that the metaphysics was a rational proof of the existence of God, right? So in the Islamic Middle Ages, lots of works are circulating around that purport to be Aristotelian, but which are to one degree or another Neoplatonic, sometimes to an extreme degree. Okay, and the Aristotle that has been imbibed by someone like Avicenna is entirely of this character. Nobody has brought out the difference and said that this isn't really Aristotle, right? When Al-Ghazali in the Islamic world attacks Avicenna and Farabi before him and says that their doctrines are not compatible with Islamic religion, right? Averroes grants some of the charge by saying, yeah, well, actually, they brought in all these Neoplatonic elements, and that's not actually what Aristotle says, right? So Averroes within Islamic traditions is this guy who is clarifying, actually, the position of Aristotle isn't what Avicenna thought it was. It isn't this Neoplatonic synthesis. Aristotle actually disagrees quite a bit with Neoplatonism in all these ways. And from Averroes' point of view, that position of Aristotle, he thinks, is at least not as susceptible to Al-Ghazali's attacks as Avicenna was, right? So Averroes is reviving a purer Aristotle that's more closely in line with the actual Aristotelian position as distinguished from the Platonic position, and is no longer so assimilated to the Platonic position. Okay, and he's doing this in the 1100s in Spain, right? So that's the background. And around the same time, by the way, you got Maimonides doing similar things in the Jewish tradition. So right before Aquinas, you get Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus, reading all this stuff and reading his, by this point, Aristotle is called the philosopher, and Averroes is called the commentator, meaning the commentator on Aristotle. And Albert is reading them, and in a background where the dominant theology of the time is a kind of Augustinian Platonism in the Latin West. That is, it's based on Augustine. It's gone through Saint Anselm. Its contemporary representatives are people like Bonaventura, and they're a Platonism with some significant Neoplatonic elements, and that's considered sort of the basic background of the reigning metaphysics and the theology based upon it in the Latin West. And then Albert is reading all of these Aristotelians and the Islamic versions of their commentaries on them that are saying, actually, no, they weren't just Neoplatonists. They were, sorry, Joe Cobb. Where do you establish claims there's being in time? In the Timaeus is the answer to your question, Joe. He, in the Timaeus, a character who is not Socrates, but is the Pythagorean stranger, presents the Pythagorean doctrine on the origin of the world. And because since Plato wrote that, even though Socrates isn't the main character, and even though the Pythagorean stranger isn't the Parmenidean stranger, isn't Socrates, right? Isn't the Athenian stranger, it's still thought of as being Platonic doctrine. So commentaries on the Timaeus is where they fight about this. Anyways, back to the 12th century, right? 13th century. So Albert thinks that a lot of the Aristotle is more reasonable than some of the Neoplatonism, but he's also influenced by the Neoplatonists, especially books like the Book of Causes, which is a Middle Ages Neoplatonic synthesis kind of thing that comes out of the same Eastern Church Fathers as Dionysius the Areopagite and so forth, that have already put together Neoplatonism with Christian doctrine, so to speak. And these are like the core texts that people like Albert is thinking about and worried about. And he is the teacher of Aquinas, right? So we're now set up for the 1200s. In the 1200s, you've got two different traditions going on side by side, where on the one hand, you have Sigurd of Brabant is a disciple of Averroistic Aristotelianism, right? He's learned his Aristotle from Averroes. He's learned of an Aristotle that has been de-assimilated from all its Neoplatonism and has returned to something more like the actual original Aristotle, although with the Averroistic additions to it, and he's inclined to agree with Averroes over Avicenna and Aristotle over Plato, and either of them over any kind of Neoplatonic additions that he'll, put down to Proclus or something. That's Sigur's position, and it's going along with the fact that Aristotle is the entire logic textbook of all the universities. The first thing people put into your hand is Aristotle's categories, and you spend 2 years of undergraduate studies studying Aristotle's logic before you study anything else in philosophy. And Sigur is a lecturer at the University of Paris on these kinds of things. Aquinas is also interested in Aristotle, but he is less inclined to jettison the entire Neoplatonic tradition and the Book of Causes and other things like that Albert and himself took seriously. He's less inclined to jettison all of Avicenna. He doesn't like where the Averroistic version of some of this stuff is coming out, and he wants to prove that this Averroism, which is now getting reacted against as being incompatible with Christianity, he wants to find an Aristotle that is safe for the church, so to speak. Okay, so he's in debates with Sigur and their contemporaries. Now, around 1270, there's a first reaction against how popular Averroistic Aristotelianism is in Paris, where the church authorities, not from Aquinas' position or Sigur's position, but from a kind of I would say a Franciscan Bonaventura position, the Augustinians, are saying, all this is radical innovation and shouldn't be taught to people. It's people in the philosophy department trespassing on the theology department and in ways that are unsound, right? And they condemn a few propositions this way. Aquinas is trying to carefully distinguish the parts of Averroes that should be condemned from the parts of Aristotle he wants to save. And he spends the 1270s finessing that, and then he goes off to Italy and dies shortly thereafter. Within 2 years of Aquinas dying, another edict goes out at Paris condemning a whole slew of propositions, most of which are all of Averroism, all of Sigur's teachings, and 20 or 30 of Aquinas' teachings too. And the perspective from which that is done is partly Augustinian Bonaventura type traditional Platonism, and partly it's this later William of Ockham-like nominalist omnipotence of God position that you already saw in the East with Ghazali, and you'll see in the West with William of Ockham 50 or so years later. Okay, so some of Aquinas gets condemned along with all of Sigur in that period around 1277 in the Latin West, understand? Okay. Meanwhile, by the way, there's places outside of Paris where they're saying, if you still want to study Aristotelian physics, you can come to Toulouse and we'll let you study it here. And off in Oxford, they're still studying Aristotle, especially for his physics. But these things are forbidden at Paris because they're too Averroistic, so to speak. Okay, it's in that period that you also get Duns Scotus, who's reacting to all of those condemnation/reactions. And he's going to differ on many of these topics. Many of these topics he's going to want to be closer to Avicenna than to Averroes, but he's trying to avoid the Averroistic Scylla. And he's also disagreeing with Thomas, that is with Aquinas, on a bunch of these things. He has a very short life, a very short productive life. He dies at like 42 at Oxford, having taught at Oxford in Paris. But one of the biggest alternatives by the early 1300s to Aquinas is there in Duns Scotus, and partly in reaction to this whole fight, right? And then a little bit after that, you get William of Ockham, an anomalous reaction to all of this, as all of this is still way too importing Greek philosophy things that are alien to Christianity into all this, and he wants a much more nominalistic and skeptical attitude. In ways, he's kind of like the West's Ghazali of the theologians, denouncing the philosophers as reasoning about things that are derogating from the omnipotence of God in ways that do not follow from reason, something like that. Okay, so that's basic outline of the characters, right? So when we're talking about Sigurd here, you have to understand he's a contemporary of Aquinas, who's on the other side of a fight within Aristotelianism. And Aquinas is the guy who's trying to get Aristotelianism accepted in the Christian West. And the danger is that it will be, that Aristotelianism entirely will be rejected as so Averroistic that it's considered heretical and won't be let in, right? Okay, I'll pause there and let people ask questions about that history. I can't tell who wants to go first.
Thank you for the clarification. I couldn't quite figure out. I knew that Sigurd was seeming to be disagreeing with Aquinas, but I couldn't exactly figure out why. But now I see it's because of Sigurd was too close to the Averroes.
Averroes, yes. So
yeah.
So he's definitely close to Averroes. He's following Averroes, and he thinks that in following Averroes, he's also following Aristotle and
Right.
logic and reason. But the condemnations that will come down on Sigurd are coming from not Aquinas or the Aquinian position, which isn't yet an accepted position. It's coming from an older Aristotelian, not an older, an older Augustinian tradition, or a precursors of a later a pox on all these philosophers theological attitude, right? That wants there to be something like more willfulness and omnipotence in God, right? The curious thing is, although Aquinas, much later, like 19th century, is treated as like the epitome of Christian orthodoxy in the Latin West, that's much later, and it's not there when he's first around. There are people who are in favor of his position, and by the early 1300s, there's lots of people are saying this condemnation of Paris shouldn't have included condemnations of his positions, right? That was unjust, right? But he was controversial in his own day at the very end of his life, and for 25 or so years afterwards. And it was later that his works were completely accepted. Gabrielle, did you have a comment, or are you just kibitzing on the side? Okay. Jim, questions about any of that history?
I don't think I would say about the particulars. I was wondering about whether or not philosophers didn't want theology cross-pollinizing into their territory, but that was because we're focusing on this. I don't want to.
It's a fair question, and they each of them had different positions on this. It was like one of the topics the philosopher was expected to have a position on is what is the relationship between philosophy and theology, right? What things can be known by philosophy independent of revelation, and are there truths of revelation that are supplemental to philosophy? Can they ever contradict one another? One of the things the Averroists were accused of was having a doctrine of a double truth. Like one thing could be true in philosophy, and another thing could be true in theology, you could just because human reason could seem to lead you to one conclusion, and theology could lead you to a different conclusion. They mostly didn't actually have a notion of double truth, but it was something they were often accused of because they were seen to be teaching things in their philosophy courses that seemed so Aristotelian that they didn't seem to be compatible with church doctrine.
I guess I was wondering, like, the things I was thinking, like, do you think that philosophy influenced, let's say, the Protestant view of dual revelation, the physical world and the revealed world, or do you think that was something ensconced within theology? That's what I'm saying. I'm wondering.
It's not. It's not entirely within theology. It's not entirely within theology. I mean, there's versions of this in Maimonides. There's versions of this in Averroes. Where's the? Here's it. So Averroes has a book called The Decisive Treatise. And the Decisive Treatise raises the following question. Is philosophy prohibited, recommended, or commanded by the law? Right? It's not the question of are the truths of religion and philosophy compatible? It's the legal question, right? Are you allowed to study philosophy? Are you required to study philosophy, or is it? Does it fall in the category of it is permitted? And you will come down on the side that for those who are capable of it, it is mandatory, right? But that's the subject matter of the Decisive Treatise. And down to the time of Spinoza, people will be, this is a traditional problem from, roughly 1150 to 1650. Every philosopher has a position on the topic. Fine question. Alex?
Yeah, could we say, just thinking about, especially I'm thinking about the this flip that you were describing between, where the Parmenidean block falls.
Yes.
Is it with Plato? Is it with, or kind of with Neoplatonism? Is it with Aristotelianism? Could we say that in some way the key issue is around what is unintelligible, and whether or not there is something that is, that can't be grasped in an intellectual, sort of act, or so what I'm thinking is, when Gilson's talking about existence here, it seems like existence is kind of ineffable. It's just like things just have this thatness about them, and it's not really a part of their concept. And it was interesting because when we were reading about Plato, in Platonism you have something similar, although it's in a very different location, right? It's the beyond being. But there is this element of like something is unintelligible, something can't be grasped in a concept, and so it remains as a kind of dark, just a kind of almost like a skeptical moment. And I'm wondering if that's like, is that an issue here in some way?
So certainly the issue of limits of knowledge, of metaphysical hierarchy, in the case of a lot of the Neoplatonists, limits of knowledge of the interior of the substance in Aristotelianism, limits of the intelligibility of existence in some Aquinian positions, limits of the intelligibility of pure intelligibles in this life in Aquinas, are very much in play in all these people. They all have different doctrines on this, but it isn't the case that most of them are on the side of a complete intelligibility, except for a few exceptions. Most of them are not on the side of a complete intelligibility. Positions of complete intelligibility are rare and exceptional if they occur at all in most of these traditions. Compared to all of this history, when Descartes comes along and says if something doesn't have real thinkable attributes, it is not, right? That will appear as a radical simplification that is claiming that the world is far more intelligible than anybody has claimed since Plato, if not earlier or more, right? Plato at least leaves a certain lack of intelligibility to the world of becoming an opinion and appearances, right? So it's unusual to find anyone making a claim of complete intelligibility. Spinoza is kind of an interesting case because he's got kind of the Averroistic logical necessity version of things, along with the Cartesian modern, go to this way, ambition about the intelligibility of things that the unintelligibles are not, you find in Spinoza. On the other hand, he will insist that God is infinite substance. He just thinks that that's a simpler notion than a lot of people would read it as. certainly a simpler notion than, say, a Duns Scotus would read it as. Duns Scotus would agree with the proposition and say, and that's why it's not completely intelligible. Because he doesn't think that anything infinite can be completely intelligible. But notions of both differences in the psychology of how human understanding works on the one hand, and in notions of infinity are very much in play in all these folks. When I say all these folks, I'm thinking especially people like Aquinas and Scotus more than people like Siger. Suarez as well. But so I don't know if that helped. Very few of these people are going to come down on the side of complete intelligibility. They're going to locate the unintelligibility in different ways, or characterize in different ways. But does that result in a belief in an objective indeterminism of the unfolding of the world? Not necessarily. Mostly that winds up depending upon their doctrines of God rather than their doctrines of intelligibility. And for many of these philosophers, their doctrine of God is going to be truth-like enough that it is not on itself going to imply a willfulness or an indeterminacy. The theologians that are especially interested in the omnipotent willfulness of God are people in the William of Ockham end of the spectrum. And people like Duns Scotus will leave an opening for that for the sake of avoiding controversy on the matter, or avoiding colliding with the Orthodox Church position on the matter. But everyone before him, I would say, is coming down on would tend to come down on the side of the intelligible necessity end of things, which isn't to say intelligible to us. It's a question. This is almost almost for them these different positions. I mean, a question of a given philosophy's doctrine of how God acts, right? They also will debate the things that are not possible even for the omnipotence of God, right? Aquinas will maintain that God cannot make a matter that doesn't have a form, because the notion of matter without form is a contradiction. Whereas Duns Scotus will disagree with him on that one, but will have his other versions of the logical impossibilities that are not possible even for God. And William of Ockham will say, when you're trying to reason as though there's necessity in your mere names about things, you're derogating from the omnipotence of God, right? So you get a different. What I'm trying to say is that the notions of degree of indeterminacy, degree of willfulness in God, degree of understandability of the world are varying along a spectrum there, and they're tending towards the more skeptical positions succeeding the others, not necessarily in school influence or something like that, but in doctrinal acceptance, if I can put it that way. Fair question. Okay, we talked about being an act, matter and form, potency and act. Sorry, I want to get back to the make sure the history stuff is understandable first. But did anyone else have a particular question on the history before I try to go into like some of the characteristic doctrines of these folks? Yes, no. Okay. Was the arguments that Siger presents against, or that Gilson shows Siger giving against Aquinas on existence, was that stuff clear or unclear? He makes, striking claims like the fact that Siger does not understand what one is talking about is such an advantage in controversies like this that he is bound to score all along the line, right? And I wondered if that was clear to people or not.
it was not clear to me in Gilson, but it's clear after you sort of pointed out the distinction. What Averroes is and is pure Aristotelian ism meant. So now I understand Seger's position more clearly, but I didn't really see that from the outside or from the book. Thank you for explaining it.
So I mean, Seger wants it to be the case that if something is a full existent being, it is already a substance which has an essence and performs the act of its essence. So there's no need to add existence to it as the act that the essence performs. Because to Seger, something isn't even a being unless it is a substance that has an essence that performs the act of that essence, right? In that sense, he's not leaving enough room between the actual and the essential for existence to make sense as an addition, right? And this is going along with this kind of causal necessity side of things, right? It's going along with a certain, if I put it this way, lack of slippage or freedom between something's essence and its entailments. But Gilson's point about Seger there is that Seger is asking Aquinas, what is this existence that you're talking about? And since it isn't a what, it doesn't have a definition, and all Aquinas can do is stutter and point, right? And the thing he's pointing to is something that Seger thinks he has adequately explained by just conceding the Aristotelian point that, of course, it is the material particulars that are, and because it is the material particulars that are, all the things that actually are already have an act. They already are an act. The material particular that doesn't exist is not an impressive category to Seger or to Averroes before him, because a particular that does not exist is a round square. There aren't any, right? Material particulars include the concept of existence, and all the material particulars you actually run into actually exist. So the place where Aquinas wants this is for the notion of the way in which the actual existence is different from the potential existent, right? But as I was talking to Craig before, the Averroistic position on the possible existence is that the possible existent is the thing which is existent for only a period of time, and in the period of time when it does exist, it is necessary that it exists. Only it is not necessary from itself, but from its cause. So in that sense, there is nothing actual that exists that is not necessary. It's just necessary from a cause rather than from itself. And that leaves no room for the role that Aquinas wants existence to play. So that's the Segerian / Averroistic position on the matter.
So are you referring to like on page 66 where it starts, I think Gilson's trying to give a summary of the argumentation about substance being like the only show in town, kind of? Or is it just, are you sort of taking the whole thing into context? At
Right,
66 it says, the whole argumentation of Seger obviously entails that the actuality of substance as such be the whole of the actuality of being as such. And
correct.
Such a world to be is to be substance. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But notice the qualification he gives after that. That is, either a pure form with the substance at stake be an incorporeal one, or substantial uniform matter with the substance at stake be a corporeal one. The first part of that is the part that's the trouble, right? And the place where the actual Averroists got into all their trouble with the Orthodox hierarchy was all the things that they were saying about the non-corporeal beings, right? Because they don't have any room for an existent, but they do have a notion of there being incorporeal beings. Okay, so what is the? They have no notion of existence. So what do they do with the incorporeal being? So the differentiator of one form from another is supposed to be the matter in the Aristotelian notion of substance. So if you don't have a differentiating matter, you've only got one of that thing. So the claim was that all the immaterial forms are unitary. You can think of that as there's only one number 2, right? And there's another number 3, but there's no 2 3s in the world, or in existence, or in reality, or the place where that gave them trouble is soul. The original Averroes is committed to the proposition that there is one soul in all men, one immaterial soul in all men. There may be any number of materials that receive that soul and therefore modify that soul while they're alive, but once they're dead, it's the same one soul because there's nothing to differentiate them when there's no matter left, right? So they got into all kinds of doctrinal problems with Christian orthodoxy over the question of the existence of distinguishable non-material things, especially souls and angels and that sort of thing, intelligences generally. And this is also related to the whole doctrine of the intellect that you got in Averroes. There's this whole, I mentioned before that the place where Aristotle is going to run into his biggest problems with his anti-Platonism rather, is when he gets to De Anima and he has to explain how the mind works. Right. So the Aristotelian notion of understanding is that the mind somehow becomes the things that it understands. Right. And original Aristotle is careful enough to leave that somehow. Later Aristotelians, not so much. Right. The mind becomes the things that it understands. And by mind here, we're talking about not the brain. We're talking about the abstract, often the Platonic realm of the ideas, purely noetic, intelligible mind. Becomes the intelligible thing that it understands, becomes the intelligible species that it understands, right? So in that sense, there is some notion of the mind having the potential to take on the form of any immaterial concept, right? So minds are precisely things which are potentially any pure form. Okay, so that means there's a notion of the potential intellect, which is the intellect that can be any given thing if that intelligible species is conveyed to it, and there's an active intellect which makes actual that thought in that mind. So if not in Averroes himself, in the people who in interpreting Averroes, active intellect winds up getting turned into an angel-like being, a single one, which because it is abstract and therefore cannot be differentiated by matter, can't have one in every individual mind. There can only be one of them. It's not your active intellect and my active intellect. There's one active intellect, which is actualized in different people's passive intellects. So you and I, with our different matters, may have different passive intellects, but there's only one active intellect, which instantiates every accurately understood intellectual form in each of our minds, right? And the Christian Averroists would tend to assimilate that active intellect with something like the Holy Spirit, right? But the more theologically inclined older Augustinians were horrified at this this notion of the active intellect. Okay, so but the point is that there's this need for the mind to become the things that it understands and need to understand noetic understanding purely immaterially, that is leading to a inability to differentiate one mind from another because they have no matter, right? And the Aristotelian notion of substance, one form and another form can only differ if they have different matter. So if they're without matter, they're the same thing. So and that leads to this in the Averroistic notion. It means that when the mind understands the active intellect, it becomes the active intellect.
Does he wind up getting into later in the book how these things are viewed post-Descartes? So I'm interested to see how that would be reinterpreted.
Yes, he does go beyond Descartes. He'll get to some of the Kants and some of the other later moderns. He's not going to go all the way up to the present day. We will certainly get to Descartes and the early moderns, and he's even going to make the claim that the early moderns kind of understood most of these things in perfect continuity with the way they were left by the late scholastics. So he's basically going to say that the way that existence or essence were understood by someone like a Suarez at the end of the scholastic tradition and the way in which Descartes understands it are basically the same. And he's going to claim that this isn't developed rigorously again until Christian Wolff at the right before Kant. And he's going to claim that the Christian Wolff version of what being means is of a piece with Avicenna. Gilson is bringing out all the ways in which there's continuity and dependence of the moderns on these scholastic positions that they have not revisited or rethought, and probably didn't go over with anything like the intensity the scholastics went over them. Kant is the first person who kind of takes a new position in all that, according to Gilson, precisely because he's reacting to a Christian Wolff who was, a cleaned up, made systematic version of Avicenna's doctrine, so to speak. But yeah, we'll get to some of that in the latter half of the book. He's not going to take this forward to like, a Nietzsche or a Heidegger or anything that late. Fine question. Okay, but do we understand this issue of the forms without matter business? So Aquinas famously disagreed violently with this notion that there is one soul in all men, or the active intellect is a single active intellect, right? He will insist that the correct understanding of if not what Aristotle said in De Anima, what Aristotle should have said in De Anima, is that active intellect is the singular it's the individual mind, it's the individual soul that has both the passive intellect and the active intellect in it, right? And that there are as many acts of active intellect as there are acts of intellects, and intellects are different in every intelligent creature, right? So everybody has their own active intellect, so to speak. And that's part of what existence will do for Aquinas. Aquinas will say that just as the material particulars differ in their matter, the immaterial particulars differ in their existence. So an existence, a thisness existence, is a differentiator across instances of immaterial things that the people who think you only get individuation from matter don't have. So from Aquinas' point of view, the particular place where he has corrected what is to him a clear error in the previous Aristotelian Averroistic people is because they thought that only matter individuates, they could not account for the differences in minds, right? Now, a modern cognitive science person might say instead, they should have deduced that there was something material about mind instead. That's the other place you can go. But if you're committed to the notion that mind is immaterial, you need something like an existence in the Aquinian sense to differentiate one mind from another and to explain why we don't all have the same thoughts. Something like that. Now, this would not bother the typical actual Averroistic person, because a typical Averroistic person is saying, you can have incorrect thoughts of your own all you want, but if you want to have true thoughts of your own, you have to be in conformity with the truth, which is going to be a one thing, not a many things, right? But even some of the Neoplatonists would say that. Even a Platonist might say that. Thought deserving of the name is thought that is in conformity with the truth. When it's not in conformity with the truth, it's doesn't deserve to be called thought. And if it's in conformity with one thing, it has to be the same thing, right? You don't get that in Aquinas, because Aquinas has a notion of an existence differentiator across minds, even if those minds are conceived as without matter. Okay. Questions about the separate intelligences? Okay. How is this all related to?
Wait,
Go ahead.
didn't know I was muted when I had my idea. How is the separate intelligences, that was the thing you said, this question that left, different from this one you just explicated about how Thomas comes in and shows that you can have
It is what I just explained. I was asking if there's any questions about that whole separate intelligences tissue of problems,
No.
right? Okay.
So that is what you just explained. So you're not okay. Okay. I'm sorry. I just got
the thing I want to go on to is the matter and form and potency and act, because matter is itself a funny notion in Aristotelianism. It's supposed to be the thing added to the form that makes the thing actual, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's also supposed to be the pure potential, right? The actualization and moving from potency to act is the same as the matter having this determinate form. In any of these Aristotelianisms, if you don't add anything else to them, matter cannot exist without some form. In that sense, there were people who weren't Aristotelians who talked about formless matter, right? But the Aristotelians thinks that matter and form go together as potency and act, and that all the things which are actual have the formal aspect, they have the act aspect, they have the actualization thing. Potency is only a way of talking about a dynamis, a power, a possibility space that is underspecified so far, but can't be actual, right? To be actual, it has to take on a particular form. In that sense, it has to be, determined to, right? Okay. So the curious thing is, other people have noticed this, but the curious thing is the definition of the pure potentiality of the passive intellect in Aristotle and the definition of pure matter as heil in Aristotle are exactly the same. Both of them are a pure potentiality for taking on any form. But despite the fact that the very definition of matter is the pure potentiality that becomes one particular actual thing when it takes on a form, and the fact that the potential intellect is able to conform to anything else when it takes on that form, nobody thought that this meant that there was anything material about mind. Right? Because the notion that mind is the intelligible non-material, going back to Plato, is so ingrained in the differentiation between the noetic and the corporeal that the idea that there could be anything material about the substrate of mind is, unthinkable. It cannot occur in as one of the thoughts in these philosophies, despite the fact that two definitions of Aristotelian mind and of Aristotelian matter formally coincide. Okay.
So does this mean, so Jason, are you saying that matter is whatever we perceive through the senses? Is that, because I'm wondering, could it be that matter is actually something other than, like things perceived, let's say through the eyes or touched with the physical hands?
Sure, and there's nothing in the definition of matter in Aristotle that says it is that which is essentially perceptible, right? And in fact, his notion of how material particulars manage to cause ideas in the mind requires that whatever material particulars there are have to act through intermedia onto our senses, and they manage to convey only the forms of their original things to our senses, right? It's only the form of the rock that can get across the rock to our brain gap in the light corpuscles, right? The need to go through the light corpuscles and the eye and into the fantasy and then be abstracted there by the mental operation, right, ensures that the only thing that the rock can convey to us is form, right? It can't convey any of the matter. It might need matter to do any conveying at all, because it might need matter to be actual enough to operate in time and in history and have causal relationships with things. But all that it can transmit about itself is something formal. That it can transmit might require matter, but what it can transmit is purely form in the Aristotelian understanding of how senses work, which, by the way, is also the Aquinas understanding of how senses work. In that sense, only the formal aspects of material things can make it into the mind. Does that help? As for what matter is, right, there's two different versions to answer that question. One is what your hypothesis is about what matter really is or actually is in some prior model of the world from which you try to deduce the consequences and see if they're in conformity with your experience. The other would be, what role does the matter term play in our theories, right? And the latter question is much more like an undetermined X. I leave aside my favorite comment I'm always making to James, which is that this matter that we're worrying about is from the older than any of this philosophy point of view, just the Latin word for mother. It is that pure potential feminine principle of being itself or life itself, from which all other things are made by having form imposed upon them. That is both the matter idea and the original mother idea in all the pre philosophical religious metaphysics of the Indo-European world. So if you're talking about the role that performs in our theories, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It doesn't get gracious applause from the materialist community when you say that. No.
No, they usually don't want to have it pointed out to them that their materialism consists in the worship of the mother, right? As the one principle of the intelligibility of all things. But the point that I'm making is the role that it performs in the theories is as a universal potential that unifies underneath all actual or acting things. Now, that's close to what people are trying to talk about as being in some sense, right? And to identify being with matter, to identifying being with potential, and to identify being with, the mother principle are closer than people might be comfortable admitting. But formally speaking, it is pure potency. It is that which, when a form is added to it, actually exists, and that is also the definition of the potential intellect in Aristotle's De Anima. Okay.
Sorry, Jason, I was just wanting to sort of clarify something, because it struck me the way you were describing matter and mind is basically having the same definition in Aristotle. And so the way we know things, it sounds like, is that our mind takes the form of whatever form we are knowing, right? So it's almost like you've got, the form in contact with, or the form fused with, or whatever merged with matter is one way of being. And then when it's fused with the mind, that's another way of being. It's like you've got physical matter and mental matter, maybe. I don't know if that's one way to look at it.
Yes, or mental existence, but yes.
Okay.
And precisely these theories of an existence which is not matter are looking for another term to perform the same role in the noetic realm that matter performs in the material realm, right? So something like the the thought-like substrate of thought is needed to perform the same pure potential role that matter plays in the substance understanding of being, of substance being the unity of matter and form, or the synalon of matter and form. From a Platonic point of view, this is the same as saying it's actually the forms that are real.
Right, and that's what I was sort of getting at, is how would Aristotle potentially respond to that? Because the form that is kind of merged with my mind, that's a union of form and matter as well. So is that the thing as much as it would be if it was merged with the physical matter that it usually, is?
Right, and so this comes down to the question of how universal or singular the contents of thoughts are, right? So the medieval Aristotelian version of this says that the senses give us some phantasm, right? From the contemplation of which the abstract mind abstracts the form. So there's already been an instance of copying into the interior consciousness of this thing that they call the phantasm, which is directly related to the senses, right? So the senses are those things which can take external causal impressions and produce an internal phantasm, right? But the mental operation comes after that. That's a sensual operation. The mental operation comes when the mind abstracts the form from the shape that it experiences in the phantasm. And that form is the thing that it can put into logical conjunction with other forms, logical relations to other experiences, whatever, right? But there's a transmission belt getting phantasms in, and the mind has to extract the purely formal, not from the exterior thing, but from the already translated interior centrally produced thing, right? Okay, so that's the medieval Aristotelian understanding about how abstractions from particulars works. But here's the question: that form that I extracted from that phantasm, did my mind put it there, or is it actually there in the original thing that set off this whole causal chain? And the nominalists are going to say, you put it there. And Nietzsche's going to say, you put it there, right? But Aquinas needs it to be the case that it was actually there in the things themselves. There was an actual pattern there in the things themselves that led to it producing across the senses the particular phantasm from which I extracted the particular form that is, accurately true of the external pattern. So he needs there to be a pattern in things that we are veridically extracting across this whole chain. Okay, and he'll even claim that the ability for us to extract, truthfully that way, is the basis of human reason, and the human reason reasons about everything else that it does only from raw materials that it gets from the senses that way. He's enough of a empiricist / Aristotelian to think that there is a first from the senses origin to all ideas in our minds. Okay. Obviously, there's plenty of things that later nominalists and skeptics and Nietzscheans can object to in terms of how it is. Why do you think that this process would be veretical rather than distorting? Right, and most of Aquinas's arguments for that are that they're either teleological or they're natural. What I mean by natural is the mind has these operations for a reason, right? These operations would be without purpose if they were purely distorting, right? In the same way that there has to be real causal connection in the world, where our senses would make no sense and there'd be no reason to have them, right? The operations of the mind would be useless and pointless and make no sense if we were not able to extract veretical rather than illusory formal constituents from the phantasms, right? Not everybody, certainly not a Nietzschean, finds that plausible, right? But Aquinas does. He's willing to trust natural operation, so to speak, to that extent. Yeah, I think I only answered about a third of your question.
Yeah, the emphasis was just on like the Aristotelian take on a form that, I mean, I'm struggling for words, but let's say a form that inhabits my mind versus a form, the same form that inhabits physical matter. Is
Yes.
there an essential difference between the two? Is one less than the other, more abstract than the other? And if not, then aren't we just back at, say, Neoplatonism or something like that?
Right. So Socrates in the Parmenides is asked by older Parmenides, where are these ideas that you think exist? And he says, well, they're either thoughts in the mind or they're patterns in things or something like both, right? And it's fair to say that they have not advanced much, much farther than that. Now, certainly someone like Aquinas does have a whole notion of how you get more abstract versions of things in the mind. And this is related to his understanding of language and logic and the difference between the things, the terms with which we use to refer and the things that they manage to refer to, right? And he has a where is it? I'm trying to reaching for the book that is very good on this topic. It's a little book. Ah, yes, this is it. On Being in Essence. But this one is. He's going to claim that for many of our abstractions, they are deliberately trying to refer to an underdetermined thing, right? They've got function-like placeholderness in them, so to speak. They're abstracting facts about man as such from instances of men that we have seen, and leaving undetermined which man, right? And that is for him part of the logical machinery of how we abstract. It's to that degree, he's one with the later nominalists or constructivists, that there's elements of our understanding of things in terms of genera and species that is our own, for our own purposes, that is for our own uses. But he understands those things as being based upon what is truthfully there in the things themselves, but leaving some things out of consideration, leaving some things undetermined. They are deliberately underdetermined maps, so to speak. But that's basically his theory of abstraction. And that's different from how you just see the form in the sensible, right? The form that you see in the sensible includes all of those aspects that you can later extract from that form by making mental distinctions, right? And there could be all kinds of distinctions of reason that you make about the form so extracted that aren't there in the real thing. This is critical, right? So you can have slippage there, right? You can have things which are always united in the actual existing ontologically supported thing, but which you distinguish in your mind, right, as different aspects of it that you can use for generalizations of different directions, different purposes. And those different directions of generalization don't make those other things real. And that's where Aquinas is not at all a Neoplatonist, right? He doesn't want those other directions of generalization to be fully supported objective realities of the world in their own right. Duns Scotus is going to somewhat disagree with him on that point. He's much more willing to let only partly true. Scotus also leaves room for things which are inseparable in reality and only distinguished by the mind. But he's going to limit their scope compared to where Aquinas would put it. And he's much more willing to regard things which we would regard as logical concepts as being actually real, formal, constituent bones of the world, so to speak. This is especially true of what Scotus would call the transcendental concepts. Things like being, oneness, unity, identity, finite or infinite pairs like that. These are all basic categories necessary for logical reasoning to Scotus that he does regard us as being able to not only know from abstraction from experience, but to know with certainty from abstraction from experience. In some ways, they're more certain than experience itself. Scotus is much more of a rationalist this way, and much less of a empiricist than Aquinas is. So in the Scotus-Aquinas dichotomy, Aquinas is on the empiricist end of the spectrum, starting entirely from senses, and Scotus is more on the rationalist end of the spectrum of you can start from metaphysical first principles of, requirements of logic and find requirements of logic in the necessary categories of actual being. Great question.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. We've gone for, I don't think we've remotely got through all of it, but I do want to give people a chance to ask their particular questions about the bits of this. But before we get there, before we get to questions, I want to talk about a little bit of the slipperiness of Gilson himself here. So, and I'm gonna do this by pointing out a few places where, if you're reading with sufficient clarity, right, you should, how to put it, you should stumble at some of the assertions he makes. Okay, I'm gonna start on page 42, where he's distinguishing between Plato and Aristotle. Okay, so, and he's trying to talk about how Aristotle is focused on the actual existing thing. And he calls these a distinct ontological unit, which is able to subsist in itself. This is the second paragraph, by the way, and that can be defined in itself, not man in himself, but this individual man, whom I can call Peter or John. All right, I want to point out something striking about this paragraph. He wants to talk about the actual existing material particular, that's an actual individual, right? And the way he does so is he uses the words particular actually existing thing, distinct ontological unit, which is the one we had in the previous paragraph, previous chapter, by the way, able to subsist in itself and can be defined in itself. Definition was the notion of being we had in the previous chapter. Not man in himself, but this individual man, whom I can call Peter or John. Now, the curious thing is that he doesn't give you the individual man with something which is individual. He gives you a name instead of a definition. And those names are names which are shared across many individuals. And he gives you two of them with an or in between. So in order to be able to designate the entire class that he's talking about, he has to do the farthest thing from showing you a material particular. He has to refer to it not only with the conceptual machinery of a Platonist, but then to also do so with names rather than definitional terms or specific differences, and to put logical operators like or in between them in order to get you to generalize what he's talking about, away from the particular he's trying to point to towards the class of which it is a member. Now, I don't think that says anything against the Aristotelian notion of being, but it may say something about the Platonic nature of language, that he can't even talk about this thing without employing, if I can put it another way, employing Platonism, right? He can't point to the difference from Platonism without employing Platonist language. Okay, so the individual man whom I can call Peter or John. There's more than one John in the world, there's more than one Peter in the world, right? This is something that Scotus will get to better, I think, when he talks about thisness, right? A name and thisness are not the same thing. And here Gilson basically treats a thisness and having a name as synonymous. He's trying to be commonsensical, and he's telling you the kinds of things that you know of that have names, that's what I'm talking about, right? Which is fine for pointing to it, but it's not actually specifying it in any definitional sense. Okay. Thoughts on any of that? No.
One, just a quick point, I guess, about words. One slippage that I also notice, and not even just in this text, but in general, is people often treat individual and particular as interchangeable.
Yes, they do.
Where I don't think it's actually the case. I mean, I think there's to my mind, I guess individual would be much closer to something like singular, whereas a particular, I get a sense of something that's a part
Yes.
of a larger whole.
Correct.
And that seems to be distinct, quite distinct from, you know, individuality as a kind of self-standing, you know, I mean, individual, I guess.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just in terms of the word, I suppose it means something you can't split any further.
Not necessarily, but individual is a whole lot of additional substantive operation terms added onto the end of the notion of one. To say that something is individual is to say that it is a one. And it's curious that when he wants to talk about how individual this notion is, he says, what does he call it? He calls them distinct ontological units. So again, he's using one. And all of this is the chapter after chapter 1, where being as one was the subject. Right? So we're supposedly getting away from the notion that oneness is essential to being, and we're doing so in order to point to individuals as the truly existing things, where by individual we mean things that actually have one. Things of which oneness can more truly be predicated than the abstract one that we had with Parmenides. The abstract one was too abstract. We want the concrete ones, right? The ones that can be pluralized, but there is each a one. But the point is that the individuality that he's pointing to here is really just the notion of one. But you're right that one and part are not the same idea at all. For something to be particular is to say that it is part of something, which is to say that there is some whole of which it is less than that. There's something it can be divided out of as a constituent of, right? That's what particular means. And when you say material particular, what you're trying to say is that there is a whole space of things which are matter, and there's one portion of it which is separated off by a quantity operation in space and in time, and that is its part. There is nothing in something being a part of matter and the notion of something being a one, which are necessarily correlate, logically, right? Something is a part of matter if there is a whole continuum of matter and you separate off one region bounded in space and time from the rest of that whole, and you're talking about that part. But for something to be a part in that sense allows it to have spannedness in space and in time. It's a determinate subset of matter. That's what you mean by particular and material particular. So material particular on its own does not designate individuality. You could have the material particular that is all protons. That is a material particular. Because it is part-like and it's about matter, right? It's way more universal than you might want material particular to mean, naively speaking, where you mean an individual. But if it performs the part operation and it's talking about material, then it's a material particular. Now, usually we would mean by material particular the substrate of some form that forms the synalon with it that is the individual substance, where we do want to mean individual, but we know that the thing is bigger than a point. It's not an atom, right? It has composition. It has extended matter. It has extension in time and space, but it's somehow also some whole, right? And when we talk about an individual material particular, we're trying to say something like that. And there, the point that Aristotle makes in his definition is what delineates that material particular from all the matter around it is the form that separates it from all the rest of the parts, right? So the form in both space and time that delineates this region of matter from all the other regions of matter is the thing which goes along with the underlying matter that makes the individual material particular, as opposed to just material particularity itself or something like that. Okay, and that's what Aristotle wants to designate by the substance. So it always has some outline as well as some supporting substrate of matter. But the outline part, the form part, is essential to the notion of it actually counting as a being. to Aristotle, it isn't definite enough to count as a being that you can do any kind of reasoning about its nature operations on if it doesn't have an outline. For exactly the same reasons that Plato thought that things had to have definitions to be logical beings. Yeah, great point. So I wanted to get to the part at the end where he was talking about. So first of all, when he it's noteworthy to me that when he's trying to talk about how wonderfully commonsensical Aristotle is, he points to the difference between Leibniz and Locke. So where by Locke he means an empiricist, and by Leibniz he means someone who is off in towers of mathematical abstraction, right? And this is meant to be said to Aristotle's benefit, because he's assuming that like him, you like Locke, right? That you find Locke commonsensical for his empiricism. But it's noteworthy that when he wants to appeal to how reasonable Aristotle is, he points to a different philosopher who is not an Aristotelian, but is a modern empiricist, right? So in a way, he's appealing to a prestige of modern empiricism as a way in which Aristotle will be more congenial to you than the Platonism and Neoplatonism that we just spent the previous 40 pages on, right? Okay, so what's striking is that despite the fact that that is what he is pointing to as the notably favorable to moderns and amenable to our common sense aspect of Aristotle, by the end of the chapter, he'll be making claims like that this Averroistic Aristotelian world is hermetically sealed against any kind of novelty, without existence, they're eternally repeating themselves. It is scientifically sterile. There is not a single scientific discovery against which, as long as it lasted, it did not raise an indignant protest. And no wonder, for the world of Aristotle has no history and never changes, so it's no one's business to change it. So what started off as this paean to now we're going to get something which is, so empiricist that's going to be, brass tacks, commonsensical understanding like the doctor has. By the end of the chapter, the same Aristotelianism has done a complete flip and has turned into a scientifically sterile thing that is objected to every single scientific discovery, right? So there's the same appeal to how scientifically fruitful something is that in a way we had with the Lockean empiricism, although it's curious that he contrasted it with Leibniz, who is possibly more scientifically fecund than perhaps Locke was, but leave that aside. There's still an appeal to modernity, empiricism, and science at the beginning of the chapter and at the end of the chapter, with the same standard appealed to in both places, but the sign of valuation on the Aristotelianism being discussed has completely flipped in the course of the chapter. So did anyone else notice that and how striking that is? He's very up on Aristotelianism coming in because he's contrasting it to Plato that came before. And he's very down on Aristotelianism going out because he's going to be contrasting it with the Aquinas that will succeed it, right? So that to me is striking, and it's the Aristotle that is being reacted to with that harshness at the end of the chapter is the Aristotle of Siger of Brabant or of Spinoza, perhaps, which is the immediate counterparty of Aquinas's own debate in the middle 1200s, right? So from the standpoint of all the Platonists before, Siger and Aquinas are both talking about Aristotle, and so that's a good reason for the intro to say this Aristotle is more congenial than all that Plato we were leaving behind. But by the end of the chapter, he's about to, now we have to see how Aquinas is not just an Averroist. Aquinas is not just a friend of Siger of Brabant. And so suddenly the attractiveness of Aristotelianism as such has to plummet. Anyway, that is striking to me. This is a place where I say you have to watch Gilson sometimes, because sometimes he's slippery, right? You have to know how much of an agenda he has.
Right, and you think that his what he did there is basically ad hoc, and he came in knowing that.
He definitely came in knowing that. He's trying to lead you down a path that will result in you finding that Aquinas slices bread, right? And he's perfectly willing to appeal to you along the way of how much you prefer Aristotle to Plato to get you closer to that position. But he doesn't want you to get stuck in any Aristotelian cul-de-sacs that doesn't end at Aquinas, right? So by the time you're far enough along the path that the choice between Siger and Aquinas is real for you, he has to damn Siger with everything he's got to make sure you don't take that branch of the fork. Anyway, the other thing that's noticeable here is he is claiming in all that toward the latter part of the chapter, where he's going to be, saying this is all the ways in which Aquinas is better. He's appealing to scientific fecundity, but also to a world with real change in it, and to he's going to be claiming that those things are coming from a theological indeterminism that is tied to the idea of creation, right? So the Averroists don't have enough indeterminism in them because they don't have enough creation in them, and that's going to be part and parcel of why they don't need Aquinian existence, right? So in some ways, this is recapitulating the ground that Phillippanus went over when he attacked Aristotle on the eternity of the world, right? A created world in order to be an undetermined world, in order to have a world with change in it, something like that. And he says, still, this is not yet a created universe, something that the God of Aristotle cannot give them because he himself did not possess it. Because his actuality is completely self-contained. There are, in this whole period, in Aquinas and Scotus in particular, there are different proofs of the existence of God running around, and each of them not only has different vulnerabilities to possible counter-arguments, skeptical or otherwise, but they also have different implications for the kind of God that comes out the other end, so to speak. Here, Gilson is not stumping for a rational proof of the existence of God. He's stumping for a proof that winds up with a God that is not so deterministic that the universe has no change in it. He's not satisfied with any rational proof of the existence of any abstract truth that is too static for him. Okay. Now I can really get to questions. I went through the slipperinesses of Gilson I wanted to point out, but questions?
Well, my thing I was thinking about was, does he ever get into, I feel like he's starting to move towards indiscernibility of identicals with Leibniz, if he's going to wind up going there later.
So he's definitely going to, indiscernibility of identicals is going to be exactly one of the things that Scotus is going to talk about when he talks about whether or not there's a notion of essence, which is a full substitute for Aquinian existence. Because Scotus is going to want to say that if you have all the essential determination of the thing, you have the actual thing, and you don't need an existence over and beyond it. Where all the actual determinants, all the essential determinations of things include how long it exists, where it exists, what matter was supporting it. All of those are parts of the full essence of the thing to Scotus, right? The other place where this indiscernibles business has come up is the are there more than one of things if those things are immaterial? And that's another place where Aquinas is going to want existence to come in to allow for the possibility of there being more than one of an immaterial thing. Whereas according to the substance notion, if matter is the principle that individuates the things in the substance notion, if something is without matter, it's identical to everything else that shares its essence. There's nothing else to differentiate them. So from that point of view, to the substance is being Aristotelians, there is only one of each immaterial thing, right? So that means that they are indiscernible because they share an essence, and they are, because they are immaterial, there's nothing else to individuate them. So there is only one of them to the Aristotelian substance being people, but not to Aquinas, who wants there it to be possible for each of them to have a distinct existence that each of those essences needs in order to actually be. So that the actuality of the being of an essence to Aquinas is going to require an existence on top of its essential definition, and even if it doesn't have an individuating matter. Scotus, on the other hand, is going to come out on the line that if you have all the essential determinations of the thing, matter, whether it's material or not, you have the whole thing. But he's going to think that the things which you regard as the same immaterial thing are actually different immaterial things because they have different definitions. There's some other definition in which they differ. Sorry, go ahead.
So does that? I'm just trying to. Thank you for that. Does that mean that in the realm of the mind or the immaterial, that or abstractions, I'm going to convolute this.
Yeah, that's fine.
Like that there's this thing that's math. It exists and it's abstract, but there's differentiation about the way that math can be understood. Is that a particular, like going back to what Alex had asked about particularism versus identity
individuality,
and all those things are trying.
Yeah. So the claim is that the substance Aristotelians are committed to the proposition that for all those mathematical objects, there is only one of any given definition of them. There's only one two. There's only one equilateral triangle, right? So there may be other definitions, which are things which can have many instances, which are more general definitions. You know, a billion groups, right? There's more than one, right? But the notion of a billion group, there's only one of those, right? So that's what, according to Gilson, the Aristotelian substance being people are committed to. Aquinas is not. Scotus is committed to the notion that there is only one of them if they have literally no difference in their definition, but he thinks you can ramify the differences in their definitions to handle all the cases that you would want to use to differentiate them, right? You can take all of the twos and give them another characteristic of their index number among twos. There's two number one, two number two, two number three, two number four, whatever, right? And Scotus thinks you can always do that with any abstract or immaterial thing or being or concept or notion, right? Such that you're not troubled by the fact there's only one of each of them, right? Aquinas, on the other hand, thinks that there's a meaningful sense in which you can have a different existence for each of several immaterial things, which have the same, at least specific definition. Whether or not they have the same definition in the full Scotian version, different question. But they have at least the same essential definition, and that doesn't mean that they are numerically the same. They each also have the possibility of an existence that can be added to their essence, which would make them be or not be, depending on whether or not that existence occurs or does not occur actually. And to Aquinas, this is especially important because he wants there to be actually existing material things, not immaterial things, not just numbers, right? He doesn't want immaterial things to map onto math. He wants there to be immaterial things that have the same relation to possible and actual existence that material things have to possible and actual existence. That is, they can have any degree of temporal duration, et cetera, right? And that winds up meaning something like a substantial revision to what matter means for Aquinas, because matter is no longer the only differentiator of conceptual essences. There's now another potential differentiator of essences, and that means that matter is now, in a sense, a special subset of differentiating essences that isn't the only way to differentiate them. And that leaves him, if you like, far more room for actual immaterial things. Does that help?
Yes, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that all plays out through the rest of the book. That's interesting.
I don't know that Gilson is going to give you the pure Aquinian position in any one chapter. He's always going to be differentiating him from all the other people he thinks are wrong about it. But that's the background Aquinian position that is dancing around all these things he's differentiating it from, and part of why. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, independent of immaterial creatures like perhaps angels that Aquinas might have been thinking about, what about Casper the Friendly Ghost, an immaterial being?
Yes.
With individuation.
Yes. So people like Scotus will say that any essence is a possible being unless it is repugnant to being. And how wide the notion of repugnant to being the essence is, he's not going to determine too strictly for you. So all the contradictions in terms are repugnant to being. There are no round squares, right? Whether or not Casper the Friendly Ghost is repugnant to being is something that Scotus would leave for you to judge. It's possible that all comical fictions are repugnant to actual being. And in that sense, Casper the Friendly Ghost is not, right? But the formal term that Scotus wants to use to decide that question is whether or not the conceptual essence itself is or is not, quote, repugnant to being, unquote. But he'll leave you to determine whether or not you want to put fictional things and fantasies, etc., in that category. A closely related position is that of Suarez, who comes after this, and he'll differentiate between creatures of reason and phantasms as not being in the category of possible beings. For him, something has to be possible for the thing to be an actual being for it to count as a possible being, as opposed to just possible in some other abstract sense, right? So from Suarez's point of view, Casper the Friendly Ghost is not a possible being, right? A comic book about Casper the Friendly Ghost is a possible being, but Casper the Friendly Ghost is not. Now, that's Suarez.
What about the Archangel Gabriel?
Right, and
people, something they actually believe in,
Right, and this is the point. So some the later philosophers that I just described, right, are not constraining in their philosophy itself the existential truth positions that this or that other thinker may have about Gabriel, the archangel, as opposed to our person here on the call, right? And the point is their philosophy is not ruling it in or ruling it out. It's saying, here is what it would be like, and here's how you would make truth claims about it, but what truth claims you make about it and why, go nuts, right? I can't answer every question for you. You may have other criteria for answering that question, right? Aquinas, on the other hand, is he's leaving a giant mansion for creatures like Archangel Gabriel to actually exist, right? And that is not committed to the proposition that that particular one does, but he's got a large mansion waiting for entities of that kind, right? If for any other reason people want to make existence claims about them, which lots of them do.
Well, Duns Scotus came up with this idea of repugnant. Did Aquinas have something like that? Okay.
So Aquinas does think that purely contradictory things can't exist. Absolutely. So
What's really contradicting about Casper?
I'm not saying Casper would fall in that category. I'm saying that round squares fall in that category, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But something which is a fiction of reason might or might not fall in that category, depending on the other positions of the philosophers. But where is it? I'm looking for Suarez on this.
Isn't
Right.
that kind of back to empiricism, though, right?
Well, we'll come back to
a round square, as
hang on.
opposed to Casper's.
We'll come back to empiricism in the case of Aquinas in just a second. I was just getting at Suarez as the person I was thinking of. He has a whole doctrine of entities of reason, right? These are things which cannot exist in themselves, but which are they're either purely mental distinctions or they're purely fictional things. And he has a similar mental status for them, so to speak. Their actual substrate is the mind, right? Of both creatures of reason and fictional things like Casper, right? So he'll give you a whole doctrine where Casper fits, but fits as something whose actual substrate is a thought in a mind. But sorry, I've distracted you slightly. Does that help or not help?
No, thank you. Anything you say adds
right.
to.
Oh, I know. Another thing I got to. We talked about empiricism, right? So we have to talk about it. There's an element of empiricism in Aquinas, which differs from some of these other people, both before and after. Aquinas has the following limited commitment to empiricism. He does think that all of our abstract ideas, we first have to learn about them by abstraction from the senses, right? So in this way, he's enough of an empiricist in the Lockean sense that he thinks that our ideas originate from the abstractions we make about things first conveyed to us by the senses. And he doesn't think that that is necessarily true of mind in itself or of the truths about things in themselves. He thinks that it's a particular fact about the nature of our finite embodied minds, right? For our finite embodied minds, we never have a thought without first having abstracted something from sensible particulars. The senses provide all the raw material of the phantasms from which we extract the forms with which we think about things, to Aquinas. And in that, he's differing from someone like Scotus, who thinks that there's much more that we can know from direct requirements of logic and pure abstract thinking, and so would some Augustinians, and so some Cartesians, etc. He's way more empiricist than those people in that sense. But what he's being empiricist about is not what is, but the way in which ideas can get into the consciousness, right? All ideas originate from the senses in the sense that our minds cannot think about abstract things without first having some sensible particulars to abstract facts about them from, to latch onto. And the way he puts that is that in this life, our minds are designed to understand the material particulars through the senses, which is a point similar to what you get later in Kant with the notion of the understanding. That there's something about how the mind itself is constructed that has a particular end in view, which is to understand causal relations among material particulars, something like that. And Aquinas has that view, 500 years before Kant. It's in a way something that is extremely Aristotelian in him and extremely empiricist in him, but all not within the category of what must be true about the world, but in the terms of the order in which we must know about things. And Aquinas is full of these distinctions between, on the ontological order, the way the world actually works is that X causes Y, but the way we have to reason about it is always from Y back to X, right? So we have to reason backwards and climb up the chain of the actual machinery of how the world works behind the scenes, because we only have our limited senses and the abstractions we can make from them to work from. Anyway, I wanted to point out the ways in which Aquinas is kind of an empiricist. I think that's also one of the reasons that he's quite attractive to someone like Gilson, because he's enough of a methodological realist. He likes that empiricism in Aquinas.
So are in the same sense, are we dealing with the blank slate? When a child is born, there is nothing it hasn't sensed yet, or is it, or where do we have room for instinct or some of those kind of things that come into this?
It's not quite blank slate. I mean, because he does think that there are, he thinks even that the fact that we are designed to understand relations among material particulars, first of all, is not blank at all, right? That's a teleologically freighted thing in the mind's design, so to speak. Certainly compared to someone like a Descartes' notion that we have an inherent concept of God that we can examine for the attributes, something like that. He doesn't think that at all, right? So he's much more blank slatey on the Locke end of that spectrum than say a Descartes is or a Leibniz is, but it's not pure blank. It's more like there are determinate natural functions that the mind is designed to be good at performing, and it's set up to perform those well. And from those working well, you can climb to a whole bunch of things which are causally related to that. But we're always reasoning back from the functions we're naturally designed to be good at doing to what causal relationships which actually exist in the structure of the world to produce our experiences, to produce our ideas out of experiences, for all of that to work reliably, all those sorts of things. So he's not a pinker blank slater, but he is he does think that all the abstract ideas come in through the channels of the senses. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, that gets there. I'm
Okay.
still thinking about whether we're really, I still always wonder whether we really are set up to be able to understand something such as infinity with our own minds. But
it's a fair question. It's a very good question. Yes.
Trail to tail.
And this is something that Scotus in particular thinks much of. I mean, Scotus is, Scotus is the one who is formally committed to the idea that we can understand true things about infinity that are true across the finite infinite divide, right? And this is a question of, can you logically reason about the transcendentals? The transcendentals to Scotus are precisely those concepts that apply equally to finite and infinite being. But rather, Aquinas doesn't really have if I can put it this way, doesn't quite have a dog in that fight, or is, if anything, more inclined to say that there are things about infinity that are not understandable to us in this life or something like that. But Scotus is definitely committed to the claim that there are things we can know by pure logic about infinite being in this life. And partly that's because he wants certain things to work in his particular non-empirical existence of God proofs. He doesn't want to have to rely on a Aquinian natural causation, cause of motion kind of first mover argument, which he thinks is way too vulnerable to skeptical arguments against causality or the senses. And he wants instead to have a regression to first cause in a way argument that is outside of time and is independent of our empirical understanding of causation, but is more of a what's the substrate of what else in the change of possible being or something like that. But if you want to see where those distinctions come out the most, it's Scotus's arguments for the existence of God and the ways he's going to differ sharply with Aquinas on how he wants to do that. He thinks Aquinas's versions of that is way too vulnerable to skeptical objections. All right, great question. Alex.
I'm wondering about, so we were talking about this doctrine that says that essentially, I think this seems to be Scotus's view that essentially being or existence is a kind of predicate, or is reducible to, essential determinations of what something is.
Close. The claim is that there is some set of predicates exhaustive enough that if you satisfy all of them, you have not only fully specified the being, you have captured the being. That the being is that essence in a suitably ramified essential definition. That there is no difference between a suitably complete essential definition and the thing. Whereas Aquinas thinks there is always still a difference between the complete essential definition of the thing and the thing actually performing the act of actually existing. And that distinction is what he's calling existence.
Right. So I think that's what my question is about, because Gilson does say that that act of existing is, in a way, it's kind of ineffable. It's not something you can grasp with a further conceptual determination, but in a sense, you can only point to it.
Right. What Gilson does say is that Aquinas can only point to it and ask, "Do you see? Do you see?" And he'll also talk about how it might be motivated by the need to see the essential indeterminacy of actual existence. And from Gilson's point of view, it's also essential to it is understanding that only existent being can act in some sort of causally efficacious sense. So those three are the reasons that Gilson gives for liking the Aquinian notion of existence added to fully specified essence. It's really in the next chapter that we'll get to the ways in which, when you talk about Avicenna and Scotus, right, as being on the other side of this distinction from Aquinas. The next chapter is going to be about essence and existence, and it's going to be about whether or not the Avicennian or Scotian notion of essence is sufficient to talk about being, or whether or not existence is needed as well, right? And so that's going to be the subject of the next chapter. But if the two foils of Aquinas in this chapter were Averroes and Siger of Brabant, in the new chapter it's going to be Avicenna and Duns Scotus. So with Avicenna standing in for Averroes and Scotus standing in for Siger as the Aristotelian origin and Christian echo version of similar doctrines in the two traditions, with Aquinas differing from each of them. And if the Averroes and Siger were too Aristotelian, the next chapter is going to be about the ways in which Gilson thinks that Avicenna and Scotus are too Platonic still. But he's kind of showing Aquinas threading a needle between Siger and Scotus, not being as Aristotelian as Siger and not being as Platonic or Neoplatonic as Scotus, but taking his own position between them.
Right. One thing that I notice is, so in the first chapter we saw in Platonism, there is this moment in which we have the beyond, right? The beyond being, where, we get to this origin that is actually, that is itself not conceptually graspable. And what strikes me is that there is actually a similar move here with Aristotle, only rather than going beyond, in a sense, we go kind of under the essences. And we arrive at this act, which is, again, a kind of thing that we don't have a determinate concept of. Just like of the one, we don't have a concept. And I'm wondering if whether we could say there's any connection between those two or any kind of relationship there.
Probably, but the first point is just to distinguish between where Aquinas comes out on this existence business versus where there's a similar kind of indeterminacy or non-comprehensibility in Aristotle. The place where that non-comprehensibility of Aristotle is actually matter, not existence, right? Plato is going to claim that, not Plato, Aristotle is going to claim that matter is not comprehensible in itself. Matter is not intelligible. It's only the formed thing with the matter and the form that is intelligible, and it's the form that's the most intelligible part about it, right? But the matter itself, in a sense, just is, and it performs this operation of making something actual, of realizing dynamics potentials into energetic actualities, but in a way that is not comprehensible behind the mere fact that it is, right? And in that sense, Aristotelian matter is a pure potential, and as a pure potential, it has an infinity about it. It doesn't have a definition, right? It is simply that which is pure potential, that which is undefined, that which, you know, has to have definition added to it in order to fully be. And in that sense, the underneath direction in which Aristotle locates an indeterminism or incomprehensibility of the world is precisely down in the matter direction, right? Now, in a way, the Aquinian existence is a replacement / generalization for that, not because it's a pure unformed or pure potential, but because it's this extra thing that can be put together with an immaterial form even, that can make it be actual instead of merely potential and not actual. So there is an incomprehensibility not in what that existence is when it happens, it's just that the thing simply is, but there is a kind of incomprehensibility in the extra degree of freedom, so to speak, that essences have as to whether or not they will be an act or won't be an act in Aquinas, right? So in a way, the existence notion is performing this role of letting there be a degree of freedom or slippage between the essential machinery and what is actual, right? And it's that indeterminism from the concepts that's particularly attractive to Gilson, that he calls the thing which theologians like, right? They want there to be something deterministically accomplished by history, or history to be have some undetermined freedom to it, or something like that. But the point is that there's what all of these things have in common is there's a place where they locate an undeterminedness of the full contents of the world, something like that. Whether they're using that to have the world be truly undetermined, or have there be something mysterious about how it acts, or have there be something incomprehensible purely to human reason, or whatever, there's a place for the category of mystery, to speak Heidegger, right? That they're going to locate in different places. Some at the top, some at the bottom, some behind, you know. But that most of these philosophies have a place for a mystery, right, is part of what makes them, in a way, attractive full systems. Not all philosophies do that, but the ones that don't wind up giving themselves a much larger problem of trying to fully explain everything. And they tend to have more jarring places in which they may be consistent with themselves, but don't seem to be consistent with common sense or experience, right? There's a kind of trade-off between how consistent you can be with common sense or experience and how internally consistent you can be and how much you try to explain. If you try to explain absolutely everything, it's relatively easy to be internally consistent, but you're going to jar against experience like mad, right? That's the pole that some of the Spinoza-esques will fall in if you like. Whereas these philosophies that leave a place of mystery can more easily seem to have captured essential things about the world without distorting it completely. I could put it that way. But it's because they're under-specifying, you know, the full story. They know they don't have the full story. There's a truthful humility about where they're about the fact that they are locating limitedness of what reason understands. Great question.
And I suppose as one of these philosophies that allow for this mystery would be Neoplatonism, even
Absolutely.
though, it wouldn't locate it in, let's say, matter as such, the way it is in Aristotelian version,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, a kind of maybe
Yeah. It tends to
potential of creation.
it tends to put it up at the very top of the ontological hierarchy, right?
Right. Right.
The higher you go, once you soar past being, you might have a still intelligible level of truth, and if you go beyond that, you're going to be often what Gilson describes as the metaphysical stratosphere in which a man can hardly breathe, right? And he himself finds it difficult to follow, right? I think it is possible to go farther in that sphere and without running out of breath, so to speak, than maybe Gilson does. But he's certainly right that there are things which happen in Neoplatonism which get far enough into that stratosphere that they can only charitably still be called rational. Let's put it that way.
Right. And so I guess whenever you in a philosophy you hear talk of non-being or nothingness, or even notions like death, you kind of know that you're going in this territory, like you're entering that which cannot be thought, and so some kind of mystery will be opening up in some way.
So different reactions to the three terms you mentioned. I mean, Parmenides does think that if you're trying to talk about what is not, then you're going to be in the realm of the unintelligible, right? Plato famously thinks that there is, I'm thinking of the Sophist, that it is possible to disobey this injunction of Father Parmenides without falling into complete contradiction. He thinks that it is possible to reason about that which is in some sense not. On the particular death question, you find attempts to deal with it semi-rationally in Heidegger, and I would also say in Levinas. Is one of the, if I wanted to mention a modern philosopher who takes that problematic of finitude and death as seriously as possible post Heidegger, it would be Emmanuel Levinas. But if you're interested in whether or not that can be done, I would recommend reading Levinas. Where's that book? I'm not going to immediately find it within reach because it wasn't one of the ones I brought into the room for this one. But yeah, I'll find a reference for you. Yeah, the in others you'll find it. How to put it? You'll also find it in philosophies that are in a way determinately less rational, right? It's there in Nietzsche in the definition of truth as error and of the original over which human-made concepts are thrown as being chaos, right? Yeah, and there definitely are philosophies that get their, if I could put it this way, their plausibility and their verisimilitude by trying to be more honest about how much mystery and there is in the world or something like that. They may get as dogmatic as you like about the remainder, though. But I like to put it this way, that a claim that the world is not understandable, which is designed for export, is not humble. If I'm claiming I don't understand the world, I can be humble. If I'm claiming you don't understand the world because you can't, I'm making a strong claim, which requires strong evidence. It is no longer a humble claim, right? You got a bunch of things in the chat. Sorry, go ahead.
Jason, I'm interested in what you think about, because Gilson's pretty strong for most of that chapter, that Aristotle basically killed positive science. And so I'm interested in your take on that as a historical reality, but also just like conceptually, would Aristotelianism be compatible with modern science in any way?
Okay, so he's claiming that it killed empirical science in part because by the time Galileo is founding modern science and is fighting against the doctrine of the schoolmen, the doctrine he's fighting against is Aristotelianism, right? So school Aristotelianism and its claim to understand natures is the background against which modern science erupts by reacting against, so to speak. But does that mean that Aristotelianism is fundamentally anti-science? I don't think so. There are certainly how to put it? The emphasis on the particulars, on understanding physics and understanding this world was all there in the medieval university. The same time that you get these fights that we're talking about was the time of Roger Bacon. Albert the Great is going into Aristotelianism in part because he wants to bring back the natural science faculties in the universities as opposed to having people only study logic and theology. There's all sorts of ways in which Aristotelianism was a this worldly rationalism, so to speak, which are not brought out here because we're only talking about the problem of being and the most abstract things. There are plenty of later modern philosophers, if not scientists, who are of a fairly Aristotelian persuasion, including a lot of the skeptics and empiricists and so forth, even the nominalists in their own way. And they're in part because they are determinately anti-Platonic, so to speak. I think it is fair to say that the actual mathematical physics kinds of modern science people were more influenced by Platonism than by Aristotelianism. They were trying to be more mathematical about the machinery behind the world in a way that is more congenial to Platonism than to Aristotelianism. But Aristotelianism was traditional among the doctors for a long time before that, right? The medical profession was determinately Aristotelian, and so was most of biology down to the 1700s. So I don't think it's as one-sided as the story he leaves on here, where he's thinking just of Averroes and Spinoza, perhaps. But from the standpoint of his long influence, I think Aristotle has had an overall positive influence on science, both in the sense of empiricism, the sense of empirical observation. He founded biology, he codified logic, and these were all major contributions in a positive direction towards what we think of as scientific thinking these days. Was his anti-Platonism something which tended to retard science? It depends. I mean, Platonism can be useful for making mathematical theories behind the world, and it can also send entire civilizations off looking for, towers of abstraction for 1,000 years, right? It's not obvious which way that cuts. It could depend a lot on the context. So I think that Gilson is somewhat tendentious there. I don't think that it would be fair to say that Aristotelianism killed modern science. It's interesting, the thing that was reacting against both the Averroism in Paris and even against Aquinas right afterwards with people like William of Ockham was so nominalist in the West and so bringing in skeptical arguments to achieve a supremacy of theology, so to speak. It almost parallels what was happening in the Islamic world with Ghazali arguing against the medieval Aristotelians there. Ghazali almost did kill science in Islam. William of Ockham didn't kill science in Christianity. It wasn't because Ghazali had arguments that were that much better than William of Ockham. They used many of the similar arguments. It may have had something to do with the institutional context in which they both had their action, so to speak. I think it would also be fair to say that the failure of science in Islam after Ghazali wasn't all down to Ghazali. Some was down to others who were more radical after him in kind of an Islamic version of a Reformation kind of Puritan period that came, centuries after Ghazali. And the same could have happened in the West if after William of Ockham you had a deterministically literalist Reformation period that was more anti-science than it actually was in the West. but I don't think that the Aristotelians are the white hats in that story, right? It's too varied, and the cultural context is too different. It is fair to say that there were theological attacks on the possibility of reason in both civilizations, and that it got farther in Islam than it got in the West. There are some people who even think that some of the condemnations of Paris in 1277 and the rise of people like William of Ockham afterwards helped the rise of modern science by making dogmatic Aristotelianism less defensible, and that see elements of the skepticism and nominalism as in Occam as being more in tune with modern science than I would tend to think. Certainly Occam's motivations are all theological. He's doing this to undermine human reason, to uphold the faculty of theology and the power of God, right? But he also gave us Occam's razor in the course of doing so, right? There's plenty of modern scientists who like Occam's nominalism and his emphasis on parsimony and so forth, and they often don't even know that he was doing all that to try to establish the omnipotence of God, and the ability of the inability of human reason to find natural truths that could constrain from or derogate from God's omnipotence. They generally don't know that about Occam at all. They've never heard of it. But is that the actual historical influence of Occam? I don't think so. I think that's mostly people looking back from the 17th century to the 20th century and picking only the parts of Occam they like, and ignoring the others, or just not knowing the context. Fair question.
You kind of reminded me of a discussion argument I had with my ex-wife, who I met as a student in my physics class. When I would tell the class to use your intuition in trying to explain physics, she came back at me with, most of the students' intuition is Aristotelian, in that they stick to their own experiences and what they've gained from their own experiences, and hold that in a higher regard than the empiricism that science has to work its way through very carefully defined experiments to work through Newton's laws, as opposed to the belief of and learning about friction and such as that in class. So it was an interesting argument that went on there, and I keep seeing it come back again, in most dominantly in one philosopher that's not studied enough, but Thomas Reid, in Common Sense Realism, who came back with the feeling that what we experience ourselves is the mind of God, and that takes precedence over science, which got into a big problem and became one of the fundamental supporters of fundamentalism in the 20th century.
I will take a different tack slightly and just point out that a lot of modern academic philosophy in particular is heavily of the skeptical to positivist persuasion, at least in the Anglo-Saxon countries. And it issues in the following paradox, that we now hit 5 kilometer wide windows at Jupiter after 5 years in space, but our philosophers will tell you that knowledge is impossible. So we've never known so many things so exactly and had a technology that exploits them, and we have rarely, if ever, had so a dominant cultural philosophy that is so skeptical of the very possibility of human knowledge. Some would say that those are positively related, in the sense that you will arrive at truth more readily if you are deeply skeptical of the various truths that are presented to you. But on its face, it's just a staring contradiction. They're saying that X is impossible when X is observed.
Yeah, and we're living through that, unfortunately, in a lot of our cultural stuff right now.
Yeah. So, yes. Craig mentioned. So, Gabrielle, you said you had to read Levinas, and Craig gave exactly the book I was thinking of. God, Death, and Time. That's the one I was thinking of. Okay. Particular questions. I know that Jim has a whole set of passages highlighted that he wants me to go over, but
Well, we've gone through most of it. A lot of times that happens, but I do have other things. They're more about wondering if it's appropriate and if we will get to modern, let's say 20th century science. Thinking in particular, if we're going to leave Aristotle at this point, like I don't want to leave a discussion primarily about Aristotle if without discussing like Heisenberg and how he thought there was potentiae and how that is an Aristotelian view and how that plays out now, because this is 52, right? So around this time, I'm wondering if he ever gets to discuss how some even physicists would have said, well, quantum physicists would have said, hey, you know, I've got an Aristotelian view to a certain extent. And you had mentioned about matter and form and all those things.
Sure,
so I was
sure,
wondering.
So
I don't want to jump way ahead, but I don't want to leave this.
I think it's. I made a comment about this last time, and I'm going to repeat. By the way, this was originally in 49, I think, rather than 52. Your edition might have been 52, but and some of the original content of it is earlier than that still. But I don't think that it's that useful to try to ask of each of these philosophies of being what they say about modern physics or vice versa. I'm sure that people can contemplate that themselves in their off time, so to speak. But I think that it's hard enough to understand these philosophical ideas in their original context, and you just raise the problem by a factor of 4 instead of clarifying it if you try to put it together with multiple different later scientific thoughts, concepts, systems, etc. Right? So
I was wondering if he addressed any of that, Or...
No, he's not going to talk about physics in here at all, except in the sense that what is useful about understanding something like useful causal understanding, right? He's not. None of this is going to try to go to anything about importing science to the world of philosophy instead of the other way around, right? He's going to stay in the fields of philosophy and metaphysics and theology throughout, right? And if any of those things have bearing on other questions, he'll leave you to think about that. He's not going to try to map any of those things for you. In terms of potential and energeia, he does make a comment. He did make a comment at one point that Averroes would have liked the modern concept of the conservation of energy, right? Where all he meant by this is that the sense in which motion itself does not cease or end in the Averroistic deterministic eternal world, right, is commensurate with the notion of energy as a quantity which is conserved over the evolution of any physical system, right? Any closed physical system, at least, right? So that's the closest he gets to that, and he's not saying it as a way in which Averroes is in accordance with the truth or physics proves Averroes. He's just using it to illustrate a notion that's in Averroes so that you can have something to latch onto there. It's just helping him explicate Averroes because he expects you to understand the notion of conservation of energy in physics. And so if it helps to understand what it means to have a deterministic causality in Averroes, or to say, someone asks the Averroistic philosopher, what happens when motion ceases? And the Averroistic philosopher says, motion does not cease, right? Well, how can you possibly say that? This thing over there clearly stopped. He says, I have a notion of the conservation of energy, and so motion does not cease. The motion of single particulars transforms into the motion of other particulars. That's all you can say. Motion itself does not cease. It is conserved, right? So that's the explicating a piece of otherwise difficult Averroes is all he's going to use things like that for. He's never going to be trying to clarify the physics with some idea out of the philosophy. He might be helping you understand some old idea in philosophy you might otherwise not have access to, with an analogy to something similar to it in physics. Okay, you I think you said okay on mute.
Oh yeah, I said okay.
Yeah. Okay. Alex, do you have other burning questions here or particular passages you wanted to comment on?
Not that anything I can think of or have prepared.
Okay.
But if I do, I'll chime in.
Sure. So Gabrielle, since this is one of your first times in all this, I'm wondering if you're bursting with other questions.
No, nothing that comes to the top of my mind. What Alex was mentioning before, just about like there's mystery, it seems, in each kind of system, was something that I was going to sort of bring up. So it's cool that he also had the same idea, because
Yeah.
Yeah. And I vaguely remember Chesterton commenting on that like every system has this mystery. It's just whether it's on the outside or like right in the center or something like that. I can't remember the quote, but
I think Chesterton, if I'm not mistaken, claims that this is true of the good ones, but there are also other ones which are way more clear and systematic than that, and that's how you can tell that they're wrong.
Right.
They're
the ones that lead to madness as well. I
Right,
remember
right.
him saying.
He says that as the logician who tries he tries to say something like the theologian just tries to get out among the stars in the heavens, and the logician tries to get the heavens inside his head, and it is his head that splits.
Head
right?
that cracks. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But the other claim he makes in a similar place is that he gives you an entire theory of the cosmos, but the cosmos seems to be, as described by him, seems to be much less complicated and interesting than many individual parts of it. The thing has shrunk, right? So his general attitude is that the overly simplifying philosophies have shrunk the problem by shrinking the world. So that's a similar comment about needing to have mystery there to be plausible. Just because
I
otherwise
guess
you
one
wind up with a
question
shrunken
sort of
world.
related to that general topic is, and this is jumping ahead a bit, but the way that Gilson has talked about Aquinas's idea about existence in this chapter, even though he's trying to defend him, is not too flattering to Aquinas. He's basically just saying that Aquinas is pointing to a basically an intellectual mystery that you nonetheless know, which is fine. Like, I get that. But does that work out? Does Aquinas actually explain that in a more clear way? Or is it really just, look, existence just is, you know that it is, you can't work it into an intellectual system, so let's leave it at that.
So what Gilson is actually trying to do here is, yes, he's giving Siger his scored goals, so to speak, whenever Aquinas has to stutter about what he's trying to say, and he's doing that partly to be fair. But he's also, over the course of the book as a whole, trying to make the Aquinian notion of existence more attractive by showing you all the alternatives to it, and then claiming that definite difficulties or problems can be found in each of them. And this is a purely negative recommendation of the existence notion as handling the problems upon which he sees the others as floundering, right? I, going through the same reading, think it's wonderful that he's explained all this stuff to me, but I can find plenty of these things that are the either the Platonic notion or the Avicennian notion or the notion of Duns Scotus or even the notion of Suarez at times as being perfectly plausible alternatives to the Aquinian notion. And it's useful to me that he's laid them all out. He thinks that each of those has obvious deficiencies that will make them unattractive to someone who has fully understood them. And he thinks that the Aquinian existence notion will satisfy more by the way that it passes all these problems and solves all these problems. I don't think he's going to prove that to everyone's satisfaction. I don't think he thinks that he could, but he does think he can illustrate it by showing the problems with all the alternatives to it, which is what he's really trying to do. If you want to have the version where it's just argued that this is the rational way of understanding it itself without any of those contrast things, he expects you to go get that from Aquinas, right? Aquinas cannot write this history. Some of it comes way after him. But if you want to just know why Aquinas thinks that existence works this way as opposed to that way, you can go read a bunch of Aquinas and you'll find that directly. He's trying to give you something you can't get from Aquinas, which is all the ways in which the alternatives to Aquinas fall down in one way or another.
Okay, so it really ends with Aquinas. It sounds like you can't beat Aquinas.
He's not ending with Aquinas. He's going to end on some of the other things like Hegel and so forth, right? But he's going to well, okay, parts of it will end in Aquinas. The last chapter on being in existence, he's going to claim that not only does Aquinas pass through all these things well, but he also anticipates various things which you only find in later existentialism or something like that. So there will be a section at the end that is ending there. Along the way, he will have gone through everything up to modern existentialism, certainly down to Hegel, all the things pre-existentialist, and thinks he has pointed out ways in which each of them is unsatisfactory on the question, right? But yeah, that's definitely where he's going with all this. I find him an extremely useful guide to all of it, just because he knows the history, especially the scholastic history, so well. I have to always keep in mind his own dog in the fight, so to speak, but that's not hard to do.
Right, absolutely. Like the first chapter that we read talking about Platonism basically really clarified some of its key features for me, even though, of course, he's trying to tell me that I should discard it.
Right.
Yeah, I really did gain a lot of understanding from that. So that was cool.
Yeah. No, I agree. And his stuff about understanding that Plato wants to understand beings as their definition is just accurate. It's a very good understanding of where Plato is coming from, and highly useful for understanding him and later Platonists. And it's just plain fair, right? His thinking that that's hopelessly implausible for what we mean by reality, right? Is him and some later philosophers, if I agree with him, but he's certainly clarified the original thought very well. Alex, go.
Yeah, I was wondering on this question of Averroes and Aquinas. I'm thinking about final causes.
Mm-hmm.
And, I guess it's really maybe a kind of intuition that I have that if you construct the kind of system where, you basically have a kind of emanation of existence from the essence, or all existence is by necessity. And in a sense, you're not really going beyond essences. And gods may be gods in intellect. It seems like, so this, I guess, is something like also a Spinozistic system. And it seems like in that kind of system, you no longer have room for final causes in the kind of full sense of the word, but you end up with something kind of mechanistic, and maybe we were talking about determinism earlier, and maybe that fits here as well. So is it the case that to get, to have final causality, to have really a sense of ends and purposes, and maybe something like a good, you need some degree of contingency, or some degree of, it kind of leans towards the existentialist pole. You can't just have full determinism by essence. If you do, you end up with something mechanistic. I hope that makes sense.
I got what you're saying, but I mean, it is fair to say that in the Averroistic version of Aristotelianism, certainly the Spinozic version of it, there's more of a sense of a necessary infinite power causation pushing from behind, making the world the way it is, right? Than a attractiveness luring from the front, the independent action of intelligences less than God, something like that. But there is still at least some notion of final causation in Aristotle, if not in particularly the Averroistic or Spinozist versions of it. Aristotle is the person who gave us all four of the causes, including the final one. He will say that in lots of natural things, the final cause and the formal cause are usually the same. By which he means something like the complete adult tree is the formal and final cause of the growth of the tree, or something like that. But what you don't get is this good beyond being action notion that you get in traditional Platonism. Now, that said, there were some people who took that good causation mechanism that's there in Platonism into, if not directions that are completely deterministic in some sense, at least in directions which are predestined in some sense. You get, Augustinians of a predestinationist variety who think that the action of the good on the mind is necessary, and this is related to the question of are there sins other than ignorance in a particular final good causality version of the world. So the point that I'm making is, it seems to me possible to put together something like a good metaphysics with something way more deterministic than you might think. It may be that you find the good version as having more room for an indeterminism, but it's not obvious that it's necessary. The other direction in which you get a difference between the two things you're tending to line up there is you do get theological / will views where there is a willfulness of the activity of the transcendental, so to speak, which is completely undetermined, but is very far from being anything like, it's not Neoplatonic good causation, right? Either, right? It's unknowably undetermined. Right, the notion of infinite freedom in God or something you get in like a Ghazali, right, is not. It's got all the indeterminism you could want, right, but it doesn't necessarily leave it with any good causation. But anyway, is it final causation? Not necessarily. The point is that you might think that it is the case that efficient causation, power causation, determinism would all always line up, and that anything which was introducing goodness would introduce indeterminism, or anything that was introducing indeterminism would introduce goodness. This is not observed. I'm trying to tell you. Instead, all the possibilities are occupied. You can find someone, advocating for any mixed set of changes in that position. I do think that people tend to have philosophical tendencies for certain of those combinations together, so to speak, that are genial to them at different times. But they also have knockdown dragouts about it. I mean, I'm thinking of the Jansenist controversy in France or something like that, where they're fighting about. People are worried that if you leave too much freedom to the to the individual will, you will derogate from the foreknowledge of God, right? They're importing something somewhat Calvinist into their understanding of God's action because they think that it is doctrinaire Augustine, even though they've maybe forgotten the good causation that was there in original Augustine. But anyway, I just trying to show you that there's historical variety on the subject, if that helps. All right, Craig, you have okay. Then I'm going to give Jim a chance to go to any of his other unanswered questions, concerns, or particular passages that he's highlighted that we haven't covered.
The only thing I had was just a comment, because believe it or not, we actually got through a lot of it, and it was just
Great.
Maybe a living cat is better than a dead king, but I'm not sure a living dog is better than a dead philosopher. It was one of the he made a comment about a living dog is better than a dead king. He was getting into at 45, so I just wrote a little comment to try to amuse myself. That's it.
Right. So
we answered questions about the good being ensconced within Plato's being. There's all those questions were answered. A lot of things that were on that I made notes about.
It is interesting though that he said the context of your remark was nothing is more widespread among men than the certitude of the all importance of existence. As the saying goes, living dog is better than a dead king. We also know that when they what they know as men philosophers allow would forget as philosophers. Okay, so the interesting thing there is he thinks of living and dead as clearly being and non-being, right? If the question of existence is implicated in the living dog and the dead king, then this is the same as saying that the living things are such things that cease to be when they cease to live, right? He's doing this at the same time that he is a partisan of Thomism, which is dedicated to the proposition that existence is something which applies to immaterial beings, of which his paradigm case is the individual human soul. So the example he picks has is appealing to a belief that you have in the permanence of individual death that the philosopher he is upholding denies, and advocates his notion of existence precisely in order to enable him to deny it. That's what's curious to me about that passage. So as rhetoric, he has to appeal to your common sense there, but your common sense is based upon a notion that Aquinas is developing his notion of existence precisely in order to address. How dead is the dead king is the question you have to ask yourself. What is the existence of the king such that his death is the end of it?
Yeah, I think that's why I put the note about a dead philosopher is better than a living dog, because the ideas are still going, right?
Maybe. The famous Hegelian remark was that the person remarked to Hegel that we can see farther than our predecessors because we stand upon the shoulders of giants, right? And Hegel's reply was, is this also true of the louse on the head of a philosopher, right? But he was not bringing up dead philosophers. He was only talking about living ones. And he was trying to explain that physical position is not sufficient to see farther. Okay. I think the one thing that we really didn't touch on in this chapter that we could have easily touched on more was the creation question, right? Understanding the world as a created thing and what this may mean for existence versus substance. And the point that he's making here is that the traditional Aristotelian cosmos is an uncreated cosmos. This is the famous eternity of the world question. So we're clear on it. Aquinas does not think that the newness of the world in time can be proved. He thinks that the eternity or non-eternity of the world, that neither side of it can be proved by reason, and that Aristotle's arguments for the eternity of the world only disprove shallow or incorrect notions of the possibility of the beginning of the world in time. They do that, but they don't do only that. They do not manage to exclude the possibility of beginning of the world in time. Just to be clear about what Aquinas thinks on the question. He doesn't think it's a question which is decidable by reason. Joe, you had a question?
In regarding to something like the Big Bang Theory, which has to be a creation myth of some sort. What's the ontological status of that? Is that Platonic just because it's been figured out all through mathematical models? Or, I mean, I'm just a bit confused there because creation is something that I sort of like the eternal idea, but Big Bang is a puzzle.
Right. So it is fair to say that modern science, to the extent that it has come down on a decision between the question of world having a beginning in time and world is eternal, has mostly come down that the evidence is in favor of the world having a beginning in time. right? Which was not known remotely in that era. There are modern scientists / amateur metaphysicians who will try to find, landscape universe inflation theories in which they can, have an eternal multiverse in which they can have the beginning of our material universe in time still subsist inside of a larger thing that can meet the Aristotelian arguments, something like that. But it's all extremely forced, right? They don't have evidence for it. They're just coming up with a scheme in which it is barely possible, right? If the ancients or medievals could see our philosophers discoursing on the evidence for the two, they would think that, oh, science has proven that Plato was right on the question and Aristotle was wrong on the question, by the lights of the evidence, at least. I'm pointing out these physical theorists / amateur metaphysicians to show that it's not proven in the sense of the alternative has been proven to be impossible. They're more inventive than that in physics, right? But if you just wanted to know which direction the evidence points towards a beginning of at least our piece of the material universe in time, right? So fair question. You can ask, how dispositive any of that evidence is, but that's the direction of the evidence. And
Certainly,
all of these people would have seen that as evidence in favor of Plato's Timaeus account or a revealed religion account, but not of an Aristotelian or a Veroistic account.
Yeah, well, clearly the concept of the arrow of time, the movement of time that we still see in Heidegger, might point to the beginning and therefore after that idea.
Yes, I mean, if you there's all kinds of paradoxes that follow from infinite past time, and this was made much of by people like Kant, who considers this question one of the antinomies of pure reason, in the sense that he thinks that you can, starting from either premise, prove that the other is logically impossible, right? With arguments that will seem persuasive to your reason, with such evidence as it has, right? There are similar antinomies for things about continuity versus discreteness of the world, or whether or not there is a smallest constituent element of the world, or the world is infinitely divisible, and et cetera, right? So there are later critical or skeptical philosophies that think that you can prove that these questions cannot be determined by human reason abstractly from first principles, right? There may be others that will try to claim you also cannot decide it by evidence, at least not with anything like a final certainty or something like that. But I just want to make sure that we understand what Aquinas's position was on the subject. He did not think that he could prove that the world had a beginning in time against Aristotle's proofs that the world did not have a beginning in time. He thought that he could show that Aristotle's proof for the world having no beginning in time only worked against particular bad arguments for the beginning of the world in time, and they don't work against it tout court, and that what you're left with is both things seem possible, right? Just from the abstract reasoning. This was the same conclusion, by the way, that John Phillippanus arrived at when he was arguing against Aristotle and Proclus on the eternity of the world. He goes through all the arguments that Proclus is a Neoplatonist, but he's a Neoplatonist who's put Plato together with Aristotle and is committed to the proposition that the world is eternal. And so he has to explain away lots of things that are there in Plato. And Phillippanus will go through and take apart all of Proclus's arguments for the supposed necessity of the eternity of the world. And along the way, he will have to make use of something like the notion of a creation from nothing, which is one of the reasons why his arguments were somewhat scandalous to later scientists or rationalists. But if you actually read his argument that there is creation from nothing, it's remarkably clear and remarkably good, and it's not about the creation of the whole world from nothing. He's just trying to tell you that most of the things that you think and reason about are so subsistent rather than existent that you always reason about them as though they are created from nothing. If you're talking about the form of something, It was not created from some pre-existing form that was a piece of it. It's created from nothing, right? In other words, everything information-like or arrangement-like is always created out of nothing. Has no requirement for any preceding arrangement in the way that it is, right? So the notion that creation from nothing is impossible is part and parcel of a belief that there is no actuality without the material substrate, and that the material substrate therefore always preexists any change. But all the things which are form-like or information-like, we reason about them all the time as though they are created without a precursor, and disappear into nothingness when they're no longer there. Anyway, it's worth looking at the actual arguments there. They're surprisingly good on the Phillippanus side of it. He's not appealing to mystery. He's not appealing to theology to try to argue that something like creation out of nothing is possible. He's appealing to things like shape. And the claim is that matter itself could easily just be a shape. That corporeality can be thought of as a shape in logical space. And since other shapes are created without substrate, why couldn't materiality be created without a substrate if it's just an arrangement? It's a surprisingly sophisticated argument, is what I'm trying to make. Anyway, I don't know if that helped, Joe.
Well, it all helps a little.
Any more, Jim? I think that was a no on mute.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Okay.
It's been great.
All right. Well, I will certainly put this up. I need to know when people want to meet again for 3. So we should have a little bit of a sketch of what's in 3. Essence and existence, name of the chapter. So from the fact that it's got existence in it, finally, we know that we're going to have some Aquinas in it. But the fundamental foils here are Suarez, Scotus, and Avicenna. And if I could put it this way, they're the people who are post-Aristotle, have assimilated portions of Aristotle, but have a notion of being that is going to relate it to essence, or is going to rehabilitate the essence determination of Platonism, while admitting or agreeing that it is the material particulars that most fully are. So they've got the individuality notion from Aristotle. They've conceded the individuality notion of Aristotle, but they're still going to go for a Platonic essentiality anyway, right? So the theorists that think that an essentiality notion can suffice without a need for an extra existence of the individuals are all in this tradition, from Avicenna through Duns Scotus to Suarez. And they have different takes along that way, but all of them are enough influenced by Aristotle that they're going to agree with something like, yes, being is individual being, but the being of the individual being is fundamentally its essence, right? So that's the characteristic set of people that we're going to have in this chapter, and they're going to be contrasted in various ways with Aquinas, of course. But the point is, these folks don't need a notion of existence, despite all the reasons I've told you that you can't be, you can't understand being without existence, and you can't be a Christian without existence. Here we've got, some of the greatest scholastic Christian theologians and philosophers that have a notion of being that depends entirely on essence, without existence, post-Aristotle, and not because they're just haven't heard of Aristotelian focus on individual being, right? So in a way, this is the peak of the scholastic rivals to Aquinas, right? In the sense of people like Scotus and Suarez are the other scholastics that disagree with Aquinas on the necessity of the extra doctrine of existence. And he puts Avicenna in there because I think rightly he thinks that the notion of essence that they start from is if not entirely equivalent to, it is at least derived from in a linear successor to the position of Avicenna. To quickly explain Avicenna, Avicenna does leave a room for an existence and even a necessary existence, but to Avicenna, the only necessary existent thing is God. God is defined by necessary existence. So he has a being at the top of his hierarchy as opposed to other things above it in the Platonic scheme. But God as the necessary being confers such being as other things have upon them. But what they are that has such being conferred upon them is essences similar in content to thoughts of God. That's what you get in Avicenna. And there's, various subtle differences on that in the later Christian scholastics, but they're going to agree with that schema of necessary existence at the top of the hierarchy and no need for a separate notion of existence of the individuals or the particulars below that cannot be performed by a suitably understood notion of essence instead. Anyway, that's just a preview of where we're going. Any questions on that before we talk about when? Okay. About when. So, Alex, did you have a question about that? No, you wanted to ask about when. I want to know if people could do the 27th, which is like 2 days after Christmas, or should we wait until the 3rd? I can do the 27th, but every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. I think, Craig, you have a problem with the last Sunday in a month. Is that right?
Fourth Sunday in the month, yeah.
Yeah, fourth Sunday in the month. It looks like it's 27th, so we should move it to the 3rd then. So that way it's the first one, not the 4th.
Yeah, 3rd I can do.
And is that better for you, Gabrielle, as well? Okay, so let's go for 3rd of January, Essence and Existence chapter. Does it work for everyone?
Yeah.
Great.
Looks fine. Yeah.
All right. Wonderful. I'm almost ready to stop recording unless anyone else tells me I must keep recording. Last chance for questions this session.
Well, I'm always eager for the bringing up on YouTube.
Yes.
Because I like to sort of interslice my week of reading with the week of reviewing discussion about it, especially for the chapters I've not read yet, because this is a very clarifying process, and the book is dense, and so go through, talk about it, have it explained, go back and look at it again is the actual way to pick it up, and I appreciate this very much.
Great, great. All right, well, onward to the peak of the scholastics next time. All right, take care, guys.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks,
Sure.
everybody.
Bye.